Hey there, tonight we're diving into the soot-covered world of 19th century chimney sweeps. What you're about to discover is that beneath the romanticized tales of nimble boys on rooftops lies a harsh reality of cramped spaces, suffocating soot, and dangerous labor. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the bustling streets of 19th century London, where the air is thick with soot and ambition. The Industrial Revolution's in full swing, and while the steam-powered future is being forged, the past clings stubbornly to the chimneys of Britain. Up there, in the gloom and grime, is where you'd find the smallest members of the workforce child chimney sweeps. Now, this isn't the charming Disney version with a jaunty tune and a cheeky wink. This is gritty reality, where kids as young as 4 were shoved up flues hardly wider than a dinner plate. Why, you ask? Because someone's got to keep the fires burning, and it sure wasn't going to be the well-fed adults. Let's dig into the muck of why it sucked to be a chimney sweep in the 1800s. First off, let's talk about the economics of desperation. A typical working-class family during this era could barely scrape together enough for a loaf of bread, let alone dream of luxury. With a full week's wages averaging around 10 to 15 shillings, or roughly 50 to 75 pence in today's money, every penny counted. So when the chimney-sweeping profession waved its grubby hand, offering a meager wage, it was enough to convince struggling parents to send their children up the chimneys. It wasn't ideal, but hunger has a way of turning the unthinkable into the necessary. Now, let's not forget the industrial backdrop. The 19th century was obsessed with burning coal, and lots of it. Factories, homes, even the trains. It was coal or bust. But here's the kicker. Coal soot loves to cling to the insides of chimneys like teenage angst to a diary. If left unchecked, this soot could ignite, turning cozy firesides into fiery infernos. Regular cleaning was crucial, and thus the demand for chimney sweeps was harder than a freshly stoked furnace. Enter the master sweep, the entrepreneur of filth, who would take in apprentices, often poor boys from workhouses or families too destitute to refuse. These kids, affectionately known as climbing boys, were cheap labor with a grim job description. Scramble up narrow, pitch-black flues to scrape away soot with nothing but their elbows and knees. Forget safety gear. We're talking bare skin against brick and soot. It's the kind of job that makes you grateful for OSHA regulations today. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There were no safety nets, no unions, no child welfare advocates to step in. The Factory Acts of the 1830 and 1840s, aimed at protecting children, largely ignored chimney sweeps. Why? Because these kids weren't technically in factories, and so the laws didn't apply. It was a loophole big enough to drive a coal cart through. And if you're wondering about the romantic notion of the little sweep with his cheeky grin and soot-stained face, well, here's the reality check. Climbing boys often suffered from chimney sweeps cancer, a particularly nasty form of scrotal cancer that was first identified by Sir Percival Part in 1775. Add to that the constant risk of getting stuck or suffocating in a chimney, and it's clear there wasn't much room for song and dance. Economic pressures, social neglect, and the relentless demand of industrialization created a perfect storm for the chimney-sweeping trade. It was a dirty business, and those at the bottom, literally, paid the highest price. The story of the 19th century chimney sweep is a sobering reminder of the human cost behind the soot-stained facades of progress. So, the chimney sweep saga isn't exactly the stuff of fairy tales, unless your idea of a bedtime story involves soot-stained nightmares. Let's dive deeper into the gritty, everyday grind of these pint-sized laborers, shall we? Picture this. The sun hasn't even bothered to rise yet, but you, a child barely tall enough to see over the breakfast table, are already on the move. It's a cruel alarm clock of desperation that gets you up and out, the morning air biting as you shuffle through the fog of London's cobbled streets. This isn't a leisurely stroll. It's a harried scuttle to meet your master sweep. He's the guy who holds the keys to your fate, or at least the chimney brush. Now, forget about the luxury of a hearty breakfast. In the world of chimney sweeps, you're lucky if you get a crust of stale bread to chew on during the walk. Malnutrition was as common as soot stains, and it's not hard to see why. With wages as low as a few pennies a day, feeding these child workers was about as high on the priority list as their safety, so not at all. The real feast here is the irony of it all. These kids cleaned chimneys for the wealthy, but their own bellies were often as empty as their pockets. Once you've rendezvoused with your master, the day truly begins. You're handed the tools of the trade, a brush, a scraper, and a sack for the soot. But let's not get too technical. The real tool was you. Your small, agile body was the perfect fit for the narrow, winding flues that no adult could navigate. And speaking of navigation, these chimneys could stretch anywhere from 30 to a dizzying 100 feet high. That's like climbing a 10-story building from the inside without a flashlight or a safety rope. Just you, the dark, and the ever-present risk of getting stuck or worse. The climb itself was a symphony of discomfort. You'd shimmy up the chimney using your elbows, knees, and feet. Forget gloves or knee pads, those were for the privileged. Plus, the friction from the bricks often left your skin raw and bleeding. It was a job that literally rubbed you the wrong way. The reward for reaching the top, a cascade of soot raining down on you, filling your lungs with every breath. If you were lucky, you get to breathe something other than chimney dust during a brief break, but only if the master was feeling generous. And let's talk about those health risks. Chimney sweeps carcinoma, a gruesome cancer that targeted the scrotum, was the Grim Reaper's calling card for these kids. Discovered by Sir Percival Part in 1775, it was one of the first occupational cancers identified. But wait, there's more. Respiratory diseases like asthma were a given, and those were just the long-term effects. In the short term, you had to dodge the immediate dangers of suffocation, burns, and falling. Survival was a daily accomplishment, not an expectation. Despite the real dangers, the romanticized image of the chimney sweep persisted, painting them as cheeky rascals with a twinkle in their eye. But the reality was far from whimsical. Each day was a balancing act on the edge of peril, with no safety net below. The laws that existed, like the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788, were about as effective as a wet match in a snowstorm. They offered little more than lip service, with flimsy regulations that were rarely enforced. Yet, even in this bleak landscape, there were whispers of change. The public's conscience was slowly stirring, thanks in part to the growing awareness of these young workers' plights. Social reformers and philanthropists began to shine a light on these darkened chimneys, advocating for legal protections and improved working conditions. But progress was slow. Much like the climb up a soot-filled flue, the wheels of change were turning. But for now, the daily grind for these young sweeps remained as relentless as ever. As the day winds down, you might think there'd be some relief, but think again. A quick wash, more of a rinse, really, in cold water, followed by a hasty meal if you're fortunate. Then it's off to sleep, likely on a hard floor, with visions of chimneys dancing in your head. The cycle was as unyielding as the soot-stained bricks you climbed. You see, the life of a chimney sweep was a testament to the harsh realities of an era more enamored with progress than the price paid by its youngest workers. So, why was it that these kids endured such a life? The answer lies tangled in the economic desperation, social neglect, and ignorance of the time. It's a stark reminder that while the 19th century was a period of great industrial achievements, it also bore witness to the exploitation of the most vulnerable. And as we reflect on these stories, it's crucial to remember that beneath the soot and grime were real lives, each one a testament to resilience in the face of adversity. But hey, let's not wrap this up just yet. There's more to uncover about the world these young sweepers inhabited, and how, against the odds, change was beginning to stir in the soot-filled air. Stay tuned, because the Chimney Sweep Chronicle is far from over. So, as the soot settles, and we dive deeper into the Chimney Sweep saga, let's turn our gaze away from the grimy, brick-filled reality and glance at how society at large viewed these pint-sized laborers. Spoiler alert, it wasn't all grimaces and sympathy. Believe it or not, chimney sweeps, especially the child variety, were often seen less as victims and more as symbols of good fortune. That's right, folks. People believed that touching a chimney sweep could bring you luck. It was like carrying a rabbit's foot, but with more soot and definitely less ethical consideration. This curious myth of luck might have you scratching your head, wondering how a profession so rife with danger and exploitation could be seen in such a whimsical light. Well, welcome to the 19th century, where societal attitudes often wore a rose-tinted monocle. The idea was that chimney sweeps, with their daily brush with death, and not to mention their literal brushes, had some sort of magical resilience that could rub off on the rest of us. It's the kind of logic that makes you wonder if people back then were sniffing a bit too much coal dust. In reality, though, this romanticized perception was a convenient way for society to turn a blind eye to the plight of these young workers. It's much easier to see them as lucky charms than to confront the harsh truth of their exploitation. The truth was that these children were trapped in a vicious cycle of poverty and neglect, with little hope of escape. And yet, the myth persisted, a testament to our penchant for finding silver linings in even the grimiest of clouds. Now, let's talk about the societal norms that allowed for this exploitation to continue unchecked. The Industrial Revolution, that powerhouse of progress and innovation, was also a breeding ground for child labor. With rapid urbanization and the demand for cheap labor skyrocketing, chimney sweeps were just one cog in a much larger machine. Child labor wasn't just common, it was practically a societal norm. In fact, in 1840, around 15% of children aged 10 to 14 in England and Wales were part of the workforce. That's a staggering number, especially when you consider that these kids should have been in school, not scaling the inner walls of chimneys. But hey, education wasn't exactly a top priority. The Elementary Education Act wouldn't come into play until 1870, and even then, it took years for compulsory education to become the standard. Until that point, kids were seen as little more than miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household income as soon as they were able. And for families teetering on the edge of destitution, every little contribution counted, even if it meant sending their children into dangerous, exploitative labor. The legal framework, or lack thereof, certainly didn't help matters. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1788 was about as effective as a snow shovel in the Sahara. This legislation was supposed to regulate the trade, but enforcement was weak, and the penalties were laughably light. It was like trying to stop a flood with a teaspoon. Not until the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, nearly a century later, did real change come about, thanks in no small part to the tireless efforts of social reformers and activists like Lord Shaftesbury. But until then, master sweeps continued to exploit their young charges, often with impunity. And let's not forget the role of the media in shaping public perception. Newspapers and publications of the time played both sides of the coin. On one hand, they reported on the tragic accidents and brutal conditions faced by chimney sweeps, tugging at the public's heartstrings. On the other, they perpetuated the romanticized image of the plucky, soot-covered urchin, a character straight out of a Dickensian novel, bringing charm and a touch of whimsy to the dirty streets of London. It was a classic case of cognitive dissonance, where society managed to hold two conflicting views without letting one spoil the other. So, how did people reconcile these two images? The answer lies in the human capacity for selective empathy. It's a lot easier to feel sorry for a fictional character in a book or a play than it is to confront the real, flesh-and-blood child suffering down the street. This selective empathy was a convenient way to acknowledge the problem without having to actually do anything about it. After all, acknowledging reality means you might have to change it, and change, as we know, is hard. In the end, the story of the 19th century chimney sweep is a sobering reminder of how societal norms and economic pressures can conspire to exploit the most vulnerable members of society. It's a narrative that underscores the importance of vigilance and advocacy, of challenging the status quo and demanding better for those who cannot demand it for themselves. But don't worry, we're not done yet. There's still more to explore in this tale of soot and survival. Stay tuned as we continue to peel back the layers and uncover the stories that shape the lives of these young chimney sweeps. As the soot settles, and we continue the tale of these pint-sized laborers, let's shift our focus to the legal and political tug-of-war that attempted to reform this grim industry. You'd think that by the 19th century, someone would have realized that shoving children up chimneys was a bit of a PR nightmare. But change, much like a stubborn chimney brush stuck on a ledge, was slow to budge. Enter the 1840 Chimney Sweepers Act, a legislative attempt to sweep the horror under the rug, or rather, the hearth. This act was supposed to be the knight in shining armor for climbing boys, but in reality, it barely drew a dent in the soot-stained armor of tradition. It prohibited the employment of children under 16 as chimney sweeps, which sounds promising until you realize enforcement was as lax as Victorian corsets were tight. This legislation was like an umbrella with holes, technically there, but not stopping anyone from getting soaked. The act came about after decades of increasingly vocal public outcry and gruesome stories of children dying in chimneys. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury, a veritable bulldog of social justice, had been barking up Parliament's tree since the 1830. He and others argued that these children, trapped in a Dickensian nightmare, needed protection. But old habits die hard, especially when those habits are profitable. The master sweeps, the industrial era's unsung villains, resisted change with the tenacity of soot on a white shirt. Why such resistance, you ask? Well, let's follow the money. Employing children was cheap and efficient. 2 words guaranteed to make any 19th century businessman salivate. Small bodies meant lower costs and higher profits, and for those in power, it was a financial equation not easily dismissed. The law, therefore, was more suggestion than mandate, and without the enforcement muscle to back it up, it was largely ignored. It's like putting up a "no parking" sign in a ghost town, technically there, but no one's paying attention. But the winds of change were beginning to blow, albeit at a gentle breeze rather than a gale force. Public sentiment was turning, thanks in part to the tireless efforts of reformers and the growing influence of the media. Newspapers of the day, while often guilty of romanticizing the plight of the chimney sweep, also played a pivotal role in highlighting the grim realities. They published harrowing accounts and heartbreaking illustrations, dragging the issue into the light, kicking and screaming. It was hard to ignore the headlines, even if you were sipping tea in a soot-free drawing room. Still, the path to reform was littered with obstacles. Master sweeps, realizing their livelihood was at risk, lobbied against the act, arguing that mechanical brushes were inefficient and unreliable compared to a nimble child. They painted a picture of technological doom, suggesting that the very fabric of society might unravel without child labor. It was the 19th century equivalent of claiming the internet would end libraries, alarmist at best, self-serving at worst. As the 1840s trudged on, the battle between reformers and traditionalists raged like a poorly contained chimney fire. Parliament, never one to rush into things, continued to debate and delay. It wasn't until 1864 that the next significant piece of legislation, the Chimney Sweepers Regulation Act, inched its way into law. This act finally started to put some teeth into the regulations, requiring sweeps to be licensed and setting penalties for non-compliance. But even this was more bark than bite, as enforcement was still shaky, and old habits proved hard to break. In the meantime, reformers like Lord Shaftesbury and the indefatigable Charles Kingsley, who penned the novel The Water Babies, kept the pressure on. Kingsley's work, while a whimsical fairy tale, was a scathing indictment of child labor and played a significant role in shifting public opinion. When children's literature takes up the protest banner, you know the adults have been dragging their feet. Yet, progress was as sluggish as a coal cart on a muddy road. Despite the growing awareness and legislative attempts, the practice of using child sweeps didn't truly begin to fade until the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875. This act, thank goodness, finally put the nail in the coffin. It mandated that sweeps be licensed, set minimum ages for employment, and most importantly, made it illegal to send children up chimneys. It was a long overdue victory, a sign that society was finally ready to prioritize human decency over profit margins. But let's not pretend this was a neat and tidy resolution. The 1875 Act was the culmination of nearly a century of struggle, a testament to the slow grind of social change. It's a reminder that while progress can be excruciatingly slow, it's also inevitable when enough people push hard enough. The story of the chimney sweep is a sobering lesson in the power of persistence and the necessity of reform in the face of entrenched interests. So, as we draw this chapter to a close, remember that the tale of the chimney sweep is more than just a historical footnote. It's a story of resilience, of the human capacity to endure and eventually overcome even the grimiest of obstacles. Stay tuned, because there's more to uncover about how society finally managed to clean up its act, or at least the chimney sweep industry, and the lessons we can learn from this sooty saga. As we wrap up the tale of chimney sweeps, let's talk about how they finally climbed down from their sooty perches for good. The decline of child chimney sweeps wasn't just about do-gooders waving their moral compasses around like Victorian wands. It was also about the sweet, sweet sound of technological advancement and the rattling gears of persistent advocacy. So, what finally kicked these pint-sized labourers out of the chimneys and into the history books? First, let's pop the hood on technology. By the mid-19th century, human ingenuity was doing its thing. Enter the mechanical chimney sweep brush, the unsung hero in this saga. Joseph Glass, a name that won't ring any bells unless you're deep into chimney sweep trivia, invented a mechanical sweeper in 1828. This contraption was a game-changer, a brush with long, flexible rods that could reach into the chimney's nooks and crannies. It was like sending in a robot vacuum instead of a toddler. By the late 1800, such devices became more widespread, finally offering a humane alternative to sending children into the flue-filled abyss. But mechanical brushes weren't the only technology making waves. The shift from coal to gas and electric heating systems also played a crucial role. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, homes and industries slowly pivoted away from coal, reducing the need for constant chimney maintenance. It was a case of technology not just sweeping away soot, but sweeping away the need for soot-covered children altogether. While technology was busy doing its part, human advocacy wasn't exactly sitting on its laurels. Reformers had spent decades chipping away at the stone facade of indifference. Lord Shaftesbury, Charles Kingsley, and their ilk had laid the groundwork with their relentless campaigns, public speeches, and heart-trending literature. They didn't just advocate for better laws, they shifted the cultural conversation. By dragging the plight of young sweeps into the light, they forced society to look beyond the soot-stained facade and see the human cost of a warm hearth. In 1875, the Chimney Sweepers Act finally put the legal kibosh on child labor in the industry, but the real victory was societal change. By the late 19th century, the notion of children as expendable labor was losing its grip. The Elementary Education Act of 1870 had already started pushing kids out of the workforce and into classrooms. The idea was catching on that perhaps, just maybe, children deserved a shot at something more than a life of drudgery and danger. And here's the kicker. The decline of the child chimney sweep wasn't just a win for those specific kids. It was a catalyst for broader change. This chapter in history helped pave the way for modern labor laws and child protection standards. It was a case of learning from the past to forge a better future. Today, we have child labor laws with teeth. Education is compulsory, and sending a kid up a chimney would get you more than just a slap on the wrist. It'd get you a front row seat in court. The legacy of the chimney sweep saga is a reminder that progress, while often slow and painfully won, is possible. It highlights the importance of vigilance and the power of advocacy. It shows that the moral arc of history, while long, can indeed bend toward justice, especially when it's given a hardy shove by technological innovation and societal will. So why does this matter today? Well, it's a reminder that economic desperation and social neglect can still conspire to exploit the vulnerable if left unchecked. It underscores the importance of maintaining and updating laws to protect workers in all industries, ensuring no one has to endanger their life just to earn a crust of bread. And it's a testament to the power of storytelling, how narratives of struggle and triumph can inspire change across generations. In the end, the story of the chimney sweep is more than just a soot-stained chapter in the grand tome of history. It's a reflection of human resilience and the capacity for change. It's a reminder that while the road to progress can be as winding and narrow as a 19th century chimney, it's a path worth navigating. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, let the tale of these young laborers remind you that even in the darkest, sootiest corners of history, there's room for hope and progress. And perhaps most importantly, it reinforces that the next time you hear the phrase sweeping changes, you'll know just how much effort and how many lives it took to make them. When it comes to setting the stage for human civilization, Mesopotamia was the ultimate opening act. Picture a bustling scene around 3500 BCE, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers cradled a fertile crescent like a pair of nurturing arms. This area, known as Mesopotamia, wasn't just another patch of land. It was the cradle of civilization, where the Sumerians were busy tweeting away with the original 280-character limit on clay tablets, cuneiform, to be precise. These early scribes were the OG influencers, etching out the first written records that would make even the most verbose Twitter users blush. Now, you might think ancient folks had simpler lives, just a bit of farming, maybe some rudimentary pottery, but the Sumerians were already knee-deep in complexity. They had to figure out how to keep their crops from dying in the desert heat while avoiding floods that could wash everything away. Cue the need for some serious organizational skills. Enter the invention of complex irrigation systems, the ancient version of city planning. The Sumerians weren't just digging ditches. They were orchestrating a resource management symphony. This wasn't just about getting water from point A to point B. It was about controlling nature itself, which, spoiler alert, required a bit more than a polite request. Naturally, taming these rivers and managing the fields wasn't a one-person job. It needed a team, a hierarchy, an organized government, if you will. The Sumerians were pioneers of bureaucracy, creating systems to manage their burgeoning cities, with Uruk being the star of the show, a city that boasted a population of around 50,000 by 3000 BCE. Uruk was the Manhattan of its day, minus the skyscrapers, but plus a temple or two. It was here that the first signs of urban life as we recognize it today started to emerge, with zoning laws, public works, and probably a few ancient versions of tax collectors. Uruk wasn't just a place to live. It was a thriving economic hub. The Sumerians weren't just trading grain and livestock. They were laying the groundwork for what would, millennia later, become Wall Street. The economic lessons from Uruk could fill an MBA course today. Diversification of labor, specialization, and even the concept of credit and debt. This was where the phrase, "you owe me one," probably first echoed through the narrow streets. Imagine trying to explain to a Sumerian that future societies would create entire complex financial systems based on these early transactions. They'd probably shrug and say, "We started it." And speaking of starting things, the Sumerians also laid down the blueprint for societal structures. They had everything from rulers who claimed divine support, because who wouldn't want a deity endorsement, to the early inklings of social classes. It wasn't all sunshine and barley, though. The reality was harsh, with social stratification that could make the caste system look like a casual grouping. But let's not romanticize it too much. Even in 3500 BCE, there was a clear divide between the haves and the have-nots. Imagine if these ancient societies had access to today's social media platforms. The Sumerian king would likely be an influencer with a blue tick, posting grainy, pun intended, selfies in front of ziggurats, while his advisors debated irrigation policy in the comments. The cuneiform tablets would be filled with hashtags like #irrigation-innovation or #ziggurate-life. And let's not forget the inevitable memes about the floods, because humor has always been a way to cope with life's unpredictability. As we peel back the layers of time, it's clear that the Sumerians were more than just ancient farmers. They were the original urban planners, economists, and social architects. They didn't just build cities. They built blueprints for how complex societies could function, even if those blueprints came with their own set of problems and hierarchies. It's a reminder that while technology and fashion may change, the fundamentals of human society, like governance, economy, and social structure, are as ancient as the clay tablets they were first written on. Just as the Sumerians were busy scripting the early chapters of human civilization, the Egyptians were drafting an epic sequel that would make Hollywood blockbusters look like indie films shot on a shoestring budget. While Mesopotamia was setting the stage, Egypt was all about the grand production. Enter the pyramids, those geometric marvels that make even the most ambitious modern architects break into a cold sweat. If you think modern skyscrapers are impressive, consider this. The Great Pyramid of Giza, standing at a proud 481 feet, was the tallest human-made structure in the world for over 800 years. Let that sink in. longer than most civilizations have existed. Now, let's talk logistics, because building these colossal structures was no small feat. The pyramids were essentially the Egyptian version of a government stimulus package. Think of the thousands of workers. Yes, workers, not slaves, who were employed to haul limestone blocks weighing up to 80 tons from quarries to the construction sites. These were skilled laborers, craftsmen, and yes, sometimes conscripted laborers, who were well fed and housed in nearby worker villages. Forget the Hollywood image of whip-cracking overseers. The reality was more like a massive, ancient job fair with benefits. The myth of slave labor is as fictional as a pyramid made of marshmallows. These monumental projects weren't just about flaunting royal power. They also had economic implications that would make any modern economist nod in approval. The construction of a pyramid was like injecting adrenaline straight into the heart of the Egyptian economy. The need for resources spurred mining, quarrying, and a trade network that stretched from Lebanon to Nubia. This was an ancient supply chain on steroids, with everything meticulously planned and executed by a sophisticated bureaucracy that could rival today's corporate structures. The Egyptians had scribes and planners who kept everything running like clockwork, ensuring that the annual Nile floods didn't turn the land into the set of a disaster movie. Speaking of the Nile, this river wasn't just a geographical feature. It was the lifeline of Egypt. It wasn't just about water. It was about timing and precision, much like a Swiss watch. The Egyptians were masters of harnessing the floods, using them to irrigate their fields and ensure a bountiful harvest. This required a centralized power structure that could manage resources effectively. Pharaohs didn't just sit around looking regal. They were the CEOs of a nation that was, in many ways, too big to fail. A poor flood could mean famine, unrest, or worse, revolution. So the pharaohs and their bureaucratic machinery worked tirelessly to keep the balance, ensuring that the Nile's gifts were distributed fairly, or at least as fairly as ancient politics allowed. The centralized power of Egypt was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it facilitated incredible feats of engineering and administration. On the other, it created a system where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. The pharaohs were seen as gods on earth, wielding absolute power over their subjects. This divine rule might sound appealing until you remember that it also meant living under the thumb of someone who could decide your fate with a flick of their wrist. It's the ancient version of putting all your eggs in one very elaborate, gold-plated basket. So, here we have it, a society that was able to coordinate massive construction projects, manage natural resources, and maintain a stable economy, all while under the thumb of a centralized government that would make even the most power-hungry modern politicians envious. It's a testament to human ingenuity and organization, proving that when it comes to building civilizations, the Egyptians were playing the long game. Next time you're stuck in traffic, cursing modern infrastructure, spare a thought for those ancient Egyptians. They moved thousands of tons of stone without so much as a wheel or a crane. That's not just history. That's a lesson in perseverance and human potential. And as we continue to unravel this epic tale, remember that while the pyramids may have started as tombs for the pharaohs, they ended up as monuments to human achievement, a legacy that stands the test of time, and then some. As we marvel at these ancient marvels, let's shift our gaze to a civilization that was quietly redefining what it meant to be a city dweller in the ancient world, the Indus Valley civilization. By around 2600 BCE, while the Egyptians were stacking stones into the heavens, the folks in the Indus Valley were busy fine-tuning urban living, laying down blueprints that would make any modern city planner green with envy. If you think Silicon Valley is impressive, try imagining a civilization that achieved urban planning nirvana without so much as a computer or a drawing board. Picture this. Cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, with populations of over 30,000 each, didn't just grow. They were meticulously planned. Streets were laid out in a grid pattern that would give Manhattan a run for its money, complete with standardized brick sizes for construction. Yes, you heard that right. Standardized bricks. These guys were rolling out urban planning practices 400-500 years ago that some modern cities still struggle to implement. And we're not just talking about neat streets and tidy houses. Their water management systems were a bona fide masterclass in sustainability. Every house had access to water and drainage facilities, courtesy of an intricate network of wells and wastewater systems. Now, let's talk about those drainage systems. While modern cities are often bogged down by infrastructure challenges, looking at you, pothole-ridden roads, the Indus Valley was pulling off an engineering feat that makes you wonder who really was ahead of their time. They didn't just dig trenches, they built covered drains that connected to sewage systems, ensuring a clean, efficient removal of waste. If you think flushing toilets are a modern luxury, think again. The Indus Valley knew the importance of hygiene, and they nailed it. Of course, with great cities come great mysteries. How did such an advanced civilization decline? Theories abound, and each one is as intriguing as the next. Climate change is a popular suspect, with evidence suggesting a major shift in monsoon patterns around 1900 BCE, turning fertile lands into arid zones. It's a stark reminder that Mother Nature can be as fickle as a cat at a garden party. But climate alone doesn't explain everything. Some scholars suggest political upheaval, perhaps a breakdown in the social structure that had held the civilization together, could have played a role. Imagine a city council meeting going disastrously wrong, but on a civilization-ending scale. And let's not forget the economic angle. Trade was the lifeblood of the Indus Valley, with goods flowing to and from Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and beyond. A disruption in these trade networks could have been catastrophic. Picture a supply chain collapse that makes toilet paper shortages look like a mild inconvenience. When the lifelines that support your economy start to fray, the whole house of cards can come tumbling down. While we may never know the full story behind the decline of the Indus Valley civilization, their rise and fall serve as a cautionary tale about sustainability and infrastructure resilience. As we face our own challenges with climate change and resource management, there's a lot to learn from these ancient innovators. They remind us that no matter how advanced we think we are, we're still at the mercy of nature's whims and the robustness of our social and political systems. In the end, the Indus Valley civilization was more than just a collection of cities. It was a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless quest for progress. They pushed the boundaries of what's possible in urban living and left a legacy that continues to inspire modern thinkers. As we ponder their accomplishments and their mysteries, we're reminded that history is not just a record of past events, but a mirror reflecting the challenges and triumphs of the human spirit. And as we continue this journey through the annals of ancient history, we'll see how each civilization, in its own way, contributed to the tapestry of human achievement. And speaking of the relentless quest for progress, let's set sail across the Aegean Sea to the island of Crete, home to the Minoan civilization. Around 2000 BCE, while the Indus Valley folks were perfecting urban living, the Minoans were busy turning their island into a beacon of art, trade, and let's face it, some pretty wild myths. These weren't just any myths. They involved labyrinths, a minotaur, and a cast of characters that would make any soap opera look tame. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Crete wasn't just a pretty face in the Mediterranean. It was a hub of commerce and culture. Picture bustling ports where ships arrived from Egypt, the Near East, and the Greek mainland, laden with goods like olive oil, wine, and the Minoans' signature pottery. This wasn't just any pottery. It was decorated with intricate patterns of dolphins, octopuses, and swirling lines that seemed to dance on the ceramic surface. Minoan craftsmen weren't just creating art. They were setting trends that would outlast their civilization. It's like the Prada of the Bronze Age. Everyone wanted a piece. Now, let's unravel the myth of the Minotaur and its labyrinth, famously linked to King Minos' palace at Knossos. According to legend, Minos had a complex maze built to house the Minotaur, a creature that was half man, half bull. It's the kind of story that keeps you up at night, right? But here's the catch. While the myth entices with its fantastical elements, the reality is even more thought-provoking. Archaeological digs have uncovered the ruins of what was once an elaborate palace complex at Knossos. This wasn't a labyrinth in the mythical sense, but a sprawling architectural marvel with over 300 rooms. It's easy to see how such a place could inspire stories of intricate mazes. Frescoes adorning the walls of Knossos tell their own story, quite literally. They depict scenes of bull leaping, a sport that involved acrobats vaulting over bulls in what can only be described as an extreme ancient sport. Forget your modern-day X Games. Minoans were the original thrill-seekers. These paintings also show a society rich in color and life, with women playing prominent roles, something you don't often see in ancient iconography. This wasn't just art. It was a snapshot of a society that at its peak was as vibrant as its frescoes suggested. But as with all great stories, there's a twist. Around 1450 BCE, the Minoan civilization suffered a decline that has sparked debates among historians for decades. One popular theory points to the cataclysmic eruption of the Thera volcano, now known as Santorini. This wasn't just a puff of smoke. It was a colossal explosion, estimated to be 4 to 5 times more powerful than the infamous Krakatoa eruption in 1883. The ensuing tsunamis would have wreaked havoc on Crete's coastal towns, while the volcanic ash cloud could have led to agricultural collapse, a domino effect of disaster. Despite their ingenuity, the Minoans were as vulnerable to nature's wrath as any of us. It's a sobering reminder that even with our modern technology, we're often just as unprepared for natural disasters. Just look at how many of us still scramble for supplies at the first sign of a storm warning. The Minoans, with all their art and architecture, were no different, caught off guard by forces beyond their control. Economically, the volcanic eruption would have severely disrupted the trade networks that the Minoans so heavily relied on. Imagine their bustling ports falling silent, the once thriving exchange of goods replaced by desolation. With their economy in tatters, the Minoans found themselves vulnerable to external pressures, notably from the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece, who wasted no time in filling the power vacuum. Talk about kicking someone when they are down. What's particularly fascinating about the Minoan legacy is how it persisted long after their civilization faded. The Mycenaeans adopted much from their Cretan predecessors, from art styles to religious practices. The Minoans might not have survived the test of time, but their influence certainly did. It's a testament to the idea that cultural legacies can endure even when the societies that birthed them do not. So there, you have it, a civilization that danced with bulls, crafted exquisite art, and left behind stories that would echo through the ages. The Minoans remind us that while myths can capture the imagination, truth, complete with all its complexities and uncertainties, often tells a richer tale. As we sail away from Crete, let's remember the lessons they left us, that beauty and catastrophe often coexist, that nature's power remains humbling, and that even in decline, a culture can leave an indelible mark on history's canvas. And as we continue to explore the ancient world, keep your mind open and your curiosity sharp. There's always more to uncover and more myths to bust just around the corner. As we bid farewell to the Minoans and their myth-laden labyrinths, let's pivot to the mainland of Greece, where the Mycenaeans were gearing up for their own historical spotlight. These folks were the ancient equivalent of a powerlifting team, flexing their muscles in every corner of the Aegean. Imagine them as the Mycenaean mafia, establishing a network of fortress-like palaces across Greece, each one a hub of political intrigue and economic prowess. Take Mycenae itself, the crown jewel of this civilization. By around 1600 BCE, Mycenae was booming, its palatial complex a testament to the Mycenaeans' architectural ambition and their taste for bling. These palaces weren't just about opulence, though they certainly had that in spades. They were the nerve centers of Mycenaean society, controlling trade routes and resources like a well-oiled machine. Picture a bureaucratic beehive buzzing with scribes jotting down transactions on clay tablets. Linear B, for all you script enthusiasts. This wasn't just ancient bookkeeping. It was the foundation of an economic system that would make any modern CEO drool. The Mycenaeans weren't content to sit around admiring their handiwork, though. They had a thirst for adventure, or maybe just a really aggressive sense of entitlement. Either way, their military prowess was legendary. These were the warriors who inspired tales of epic battles, their bronze armor and boars, tusk helmets as iconic as any superhero's cape. They were the Marvel cinematic universe of the Bronze Age, with chariots instead of CGI effects, and a penchant for settling disputes with a show of force. And then there's the small matter of the Trojan War, that epic clash immortalized by Homer in his Iliad. Homer, a master of spinning yarns that mix a dollop of truth with a generous helping of fiction. The Mycenaeans, according to the legend, laid siege to the city of Troy for a solid 10 years, all over a damsel named Helen. Now, whether Helen's face really launched 1,000 ships is up for debate, but the archaeological site of Hisarlik in modern Turkey does suggest that a city was indeed besieged and burned around the 12th century BCE. Coincidence, perhaps, but let's not let facts get in the way of a good story. The Mycenaean economy, much like their military ventures, was a force to be reckoned with. They traded far and wide, their influence stretching from the shores of Cyprus to the Italian peninsula. They were dealers in everything from pottery to precious metals, their goods found in shipwrecks scattered across the Mediterranean, a testament to their expansive reach and the occasional maritime mishap. Let's face it, even the best-laid trade routes had their hiccups. But like all great civilizations, the Mycenaeans had an expiration date. Around 1200 BCE, their world started to unravel, a cocktail of internal strife, natural disasters, and external pressures conspiring to knock them off their pedestal. It didn't help that the so-called Sea Peoples, an enigmatic group of maritime marauders, decided to crash the party, leaving chaos in their wake. The Mycenaean palaces, once bustling centers of power, fell silent, their ruins a haunting reminder of a society's sudden fall from grace. Enter Homer again, centuries later, weaving tales of heroism and tragedy that would capture the imagination of generations. The Iliad and the Odyssey, while far from reliable historical accounts, offer a glimpse into the Mycenaean psyche and the values they held dear: courage, honor, and the occasional bit of divine intervention. These epics, with their larger-than-life characters, are as much about myth as they are about history, a blend that continues to resonate in our modern narratives. In dissecting these stories, it's crucial to separate the wheat from the chaff. The Mycenaeans were undoubtedly real, their influence on Greek culture profound. They laid the groundwork for what would become classical Greece, their legacy evident in everything from language to art. Yet, romanticized tales of Achilles and Odysseus, while captivating, are just that, romanticized. They paint a picture of a world that is as much fantasy as fact, a testament to humanity's love for storytelling and the power it holds. The Mycenaeans remind us that history is never just black and white. It's a tapestry of truth interwoven with myth, each thread telling its own story. Their legacy is a reminder that while civilizations may rise and fall, their stories endure, shaping our understanding of heroism and morality, even today. In a world often obsessed with the here and now, it's worth pausing to reflect on the tales of old and the lessons they impart. Lessons about ambition, resilience, and the sometimes blurred line between legend and reality. As we wrap up our journey through these ancient halls of power, let's carry their stories with us. The Mycenaeans, like the Minoans, the Egyptians, and all the others before them, remind us that while empires may crumble, the human spirit's quest for greatness is eternal. And as we continue to write our own history, let's do so with the knowledge that we stand on the shoulders of giants, each one leaving their mark in the sands of time. So here's to the Mycenaeans and their enduring legacy, a testament to the power of myth, the richness of history, and the timeless dance between the two. Ever wonder why everyone thinks ancient Rome was all about fancy togas, orgies, and gladiator showdowns? Blame Hollywood for that. Sure, there were some impressive toga parties, but the reality of Roman life was more about counting coins than counting conquests. In fact, if you were a regular Roman, your daily grind revolved around things like taxes, trade, and trying not to starve while living in a city that somehow managed to feed over 1 million people. Yeah, that's right, 1 million. And unlike the movies, there wasn't a single saucy emperor with a plan to open the first fast food joint. Let's talk economics, because surprise, surprise, even ancient empires needed to keep their books balanced. Roman trade was the lifeblood of the city, and it was more complicated than a soap opera plot. Picture a web of ships crisscrossing the Mediterranean, carrying everything from Egyptian grain to Spanish olive oil. It was a logistical feat that could make even the most seasoned Amazon Prime delivery driver break a sweat. And with trade came the need for taxes. Oh, the dreaded taxes. Every Roman citizen knew they couldn't escape the tax collector, who was probably as feared as the lions in the Colosseum. The Roman tax system was a bit like a bad magic trick. Now you see your money, now you don't. There were taxes on land, slaves, goods, and even inheritance. Add to that the infamous portoria, a customs tax applied to goods all over the empire. The saying nothing is certain but death and taxes could have been coined in Rome, except they probably would have added, and the occasional barbarian invasion. Speaking of money, let's chat about the cost of living in Rome. Forget about the glitzy image of feasts and endless wine. For many Romans, a loaf of bread could set them back a day's wage. The average Roman soldier earned about 300 denarii a year, which sounds like a lot, until you realize that it wasn't even enough to buy a pair of designer sandals. And if you wanted to enjoy those famous Roman baths, you'd better start saving those denarii, because hygiene came at a premium. Feeding a city like Rome was no small feat, akin to trying to feed a herd of hungry hippos with a single bucket of lettuce. Most of the grain came from Egypt, and keeping that lifeline going was crucial. The annona, or grain supply, was like the ancient version of a welfare system, ensuring that the plebs, Rome's working class, didn't riot because of empty bellies. The emperors knew that if you kept the populace fed and entertained, you'd likely keep your head attached to your body. Hence the phrase bread and circuses, which, let's be honest, sounds like a political strategy that wouldn't be out of place today. But let's not forget the gritty details of Roman trade. Ever heard of the Via Appia? This ancient highway was the Roman Empire's answer to the modern freeway. Stretching over 350 miles from Rome to Brindisi, it was a marvel of engineering, allowing for the rapid movement of goods, troops, and anyone with the misfortune of being sent to the provinces. Imagine a highway where instead of dodging potholes, you dodge ox carts loaded with wine and olive oil. Trade wasn't just about goods, it was about people and ideas. The Silk Road, for example, brought exotic goods from the East, but it also brought new religions, philosophies, and even diseases. Rome was a melting pot long before New York claimed the title. You had Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, and more, all crammed together trying to make a living. It was like the United Nations, but with more stabbing and less diplomacy. The logistics of trade also meant dealing with pirates, who were less Jack Sparrow and more sea-bound thugs. The Mediterranean was infested with them, and the Roman navy had its hands full trying to keep trade routes open. Pompey the Great even got a special commission to clean up the seas, which he did with ruthless efficiency. Imagine a naval operation that took him just a few months, a feat that would put any modern naval strategist to shame. So, next time you find yourself watching a Roman epic, remember that behind the scenes, it was all about the grind. The economy was the backbone of the empire, and without it, those grandiose visions of emperors and gladiators would have crumbled faster than a dry biscuit. Rome wasn't just built in a day, nor was it maintained with sheer willpower. It was a complex machine, oiled by trade, taxes, and the relentless pursuit of stability. Fascinating, isn't it? Who knew that behind every toga party was a clerk balancing the empire's checkbook? But let's hop across the Mediterranean, shall we? Welcome to ancient Egypt, where the pharaohs ruled with more than just their oversized headpieces and a penchant for grand architectural statements. You might think of pyramids as their ultimate flex, but behind those limestone giants was an administrative machine that would make even the most seasoned bureaucrat break out in a cold sweat. Picture a land where the term bureaucracy wasn't just a buzzword, but an entire lifestyle choice. Now, before you start picturing pharaohs as workaholic CEOs shuffling papyrus in corner offices, let's dig into the gritty specifics. Ancient Egypt wasn't run by a gang of sun-kissed monarchs just lounging by the Nile. No, sir. It was a highly organized society with a complex network of officials, scribes, and overseers who kept the cogs turning. And when it came to monumental projects like the pyramids, it wasn't about forcing armies of slaves to work until they dropped. That's a myth as stubborn as sand in your sandals. Let's talk numbers. The construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, for example, is estimated to have employed around 20,000 to 30,000 workers at any given time. That's roughly the population of a small modern town, all laboring away without the luxury of power tools or union breaks. These workers weren't slaves, but skilled laborers, many of whom were actually paid in kind. Forget about a weekly paycheck. We're talking rations of beer, bread, and onions. You thought your salary negotiations were tough. The logistics behind feeding and housing these workers could give any modern urban planner a run for their money. Workers lived in nearby villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, and even medical facilities. They were fed through a system that resembled a military operation more than a construction site. Daily rations included about 10 loaves of bread and a couple of liters of beer per person. That's right, beer was the drink of choice, doubling as both nutrition and motivation. Move over, coffee breaks. But how did they manage such a massive undertaking? Enter the scribes and overseers. These were the ancient world's equivalent of middle management, armed with reed pens and a lot of patience. They meticulously recorded everything from worker absences to resource distribution. You could think of them as the Excel spreadsheets of their day, keeping track of every last loaf and pint. And let's not forget about the vizier, the pharaoh's right-hand man who acted as the chief administrator, ensuring everything flowed smoothly from the quarry to the construction site. Now, let's debunk another romanticized myth. The pharaohs weren't just divine rulers lounging in gold-plated luxury. They were hands-on leaders who knew that maintaining control over such a vast territory required more than just divine right. It required strategic planning, resource management, and a tight grip on the social hierarchy. Egypt's social structure was as layered as a well-crafted baklava, with the pharaoh at the top, followed by nobles, priests, soldiers, scribes, and finally the farmers and laborers who formed the backbone of the economy. Speaking of the economy, let's talk about resource allocation. Ancient Egypt was rich in one crucial resource: agriculture. The Nile River was the lifeline of the empire, providing fertile land that fed the entire nation. The annual flooding of the Nile was as predictable as your morning alarm clock, depositing nutrient-rich silt that allowed for bountiful harvests. This agricultural prosperity was the bedrock upon which Egypt's wealth was built, allowing the pharaohs to fund their grandiose projects and keep their people relatively well-fed. But don't be fooled into thinking it was all sunshine and papyrus. The pharaohs faced constant challenges, from droughts to invasions, and managing such a vast and diverse empire was no walk in the park. They had to maintain a delicate balance between centralized control and local autonomy, relying on a network of governors and local officials to enforce their will. Think of it as a game of ancient political chess, with the pharaohs constantly strategizing to keep their kingdom in check. And what about those iconic pyramids? Far from being mere tombs, they were symbols of the pharaoh's power and divine connection to the gods. Each stone block, weighing an average of 5 tons, was a testament to the pharaoh's ability to harness human labor and natural resources. The pyramids were as much about showcasing authority as they were about ensuring a smooth passage to the afterlife. It was a bit like building a skyscraper today, not just for the office space, but to declare, we mean business. Living conditions for workers, though not exactly luxurious, were surprisingly organized. Workers' villages had everything from houses with basic amenities to communal bakeries and even early forms of healthcare. The discovery of skeletal remains at these sites suggests that workers were treated for injuries, indicating a rudimentary understanding of medical care. It's almost enough to make you reconsider your modern health plan. Almost. So, the next time you gaze at a pyramid and daydream about mystical pharaohs and hidden chambers, remember that behind the stone facade was a thriving society, complete with its own set of challenges, triumphs, and yes, bureaucratic red tape. Egypt was a civilization that thrived on its ability to adapt and innovate, using the resources at its disposal to create wonders that have stood the test of time. And while the allure of the pharaohs may be steeped in legend, the reality of their rule was as practical as it was powerful. Stay tuned, because there's much more to uncover in this ancient saga. Ah, the Greeks, the originators of democracy, right? Hold onto your laurel wreaths, because the reality of ancient Greek democracy might just throw a metaphorical toga over your head. What we often romanticize as the enlightened cradle of political freedom was, in fact, more of an exclusive gentleman's club. No sandals allowed unless you were part of the in crowd. Let's start with some cold, hard stats. In Athens, the beacon of democracy, out of a population of about 300,000, only about 30,000 were considered full citizens. That's a mere 10% who had the privilege to vote. And by citizens, we mean adult males who weren't slaves or foreigners, because, obviously, democracy was just too sophisticated for women and immigrants. Sorry, ladies, your say in the assembly was about as welcome as a Spartan at an Athenian party. Here's a fun fact to ponder. The famed Athenian democracy was both innovative and restrictive. While they did invent the concept of voting with a show of hands, and later with pebbles or pottery shards for secret ballots, Decisions were often made by a vocal minority. Imagine a town hall where only the wealthiest property owners got to decide if everyone else should pay more taxes. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And speaking of taxes, let's dive into the economic engine that fueled Greek expansion and conflict. The Greeks, much like their Roman successors, were no strangers to the fine art of taxation. The wealth of Athens, for instance, was in part built on the backs of tributary allies who paid for the privilege of Athenian protection. The Delian League, ostensibly a defensive alliance against Persian aggression, quickly turned into Athens' personal piggy bank. By the mid-5th century BCE, the League's treasury had been conveniently relocated from Delos to Athens, a move about as subtle as a Spartan in a tutu. But all that glittering gold didn't come without its cost. The Peloponnesian War, that tragic, drawn-out saga between Athens and Sparta, was as much about economic dominance as it was about political ideology. It was a war that drained Athens' coffers faster than you can say Socrates. The conflict lasted from 431 to 404 BCE, and by its end, Athens had spent approximately 2,000 talents a year, a fortune in ancient terms, enough to pay over 30,000 rowers for 2 months. So, where did all the money go? Building and maintaining a fleet of triremes, those sleek warships that were the pride of Athenian naval power, wasn't cheap. Each ship cost around 1 talent to build, and then there were the maintenance costs and the salaries for the rowers. It was essentially the ancient equivalent of running a small navy and an air force combined. The logistics were as complex as a modern military operation, with supply lines stretching across the Aegean Sea and beyond. And yet, for all the romanticism surrounding ancient Greek culture, their society was riddled with contradictions. While Athens was busy preaching democracy and intellectual freedom, it was also a society deeply reliant on slavery. Historians estimate that nearly a third of the population were slaves, enough to make any modern champion of human rights shudder. These individuals were the invisible hands that kept the Athenian economy ticking, toiling in mines, working in households, and even rowing the warships that defended the very democracy they had no part in. But let's not forget the philosophical veneer that often glosses over these harsher realities. Ancient Greece was the birthplace of great thinkers like Plato and Aristotle, whose ideas about governance and ethics continue to influence us today. Yet even they were products of their time, with views that would make a modern egalitarian cringe. Plato's Republic, for instance, suggests a society governed by philosopher kings, a notion that sounds suspiciously like a glorified oligarchy rather than a democracy. To top it off, Greek society was heavily stratified. The social ladder was as rigid as a Spartan military formation, with citizens at the top, followed by medics, resident aliens, and then slaves at the very bottom. Economic disparities were as much a part of Greek life as olive oil and tragedy plays. And while we're on the topic of tragedy, let's not overlook the cultural impact of Greek theatre. The playwrights of ancient Greece, like Sophocles and Euripides, weren't just entertaining the masses. They were subtly critiquing the very society that funded their art. Through the lens of tragedy and comedy, they explored themes of power, fate, and the human condition, offering audiences a mirror to reflect upon their own lives, albeit one with a bit of poetic license. In the end, while the Greeks gave us the concept of democracy, their practice of it was far from the idealistic vision often painted by history. It was a system as flawed and human as those who designed it, rife with politics, power struggles, and economic motivations. So the next time someone waxes poetic about the glory of ancient Greece, remember that behind every marble column was a story of exclusion, ambition, and a relentless pursuit of power. And the story doesn't end here. There's plenty more to uncover as we continue to unravel the tangled web of ancient history. As we leave behind the marble columns and philosophical debates of ancient Greece, let's head eastward to a land where dragons were thought to roam and bureaucrats were as plentiful as rice paddies. Welcome to the Han Dynasty of China. If you thought the Romans were the only ones with a penchant for empire building, think again. The Han Dynasty, lasting from 206 BCE to 220 CE, was a powerhouse that rivaled anything the West could muster. And boy, did they have some tricks up their elegant silk sleeves. Speaking of silk, let's start with the Silk Road, that legendary trade route stretching over 4,000 miles from China to the Mediterranean. Picture caravans loaded with silk, spices, and precious metals trudging across deserts and mountains, and you'll get a sense of the logistical nightmare it was. But the payoff was worth it. By the 2nd century BCE, silk had become the Gucci of the ancient world, coveted by Roman elites willing to shell out a fortune for a piece of that luxurious fabric. To give you an idea, a pound of silk could cost as much as a Roman soldier's annual salary. Now that's what I call high fashion. But the Silk Road wasn't just about silk. It was about the exchange of ideas, technologies, and occasionally plagues. The Han Dynasty's embrace of this trade route opened up China to a world of influences. Buddhism, for instance, hitched a ride along these paths, planting its philosophical roots deep into Chinese soil, much like a spiritual Johnny Appleseed. Meanwhile, in return, China shared its innovations, like papermaking and the magnetic compass, turning the Silk Road into a highway of human progress, albeit one without rest stops or Wi-Fi. Let's talk technology, because the Han were no slouches when it came to innovation. They were the first to develop paper around 105 CE, thanks to a clever fella named Kai Lun. Before this, people were scribbling on bamboo slips or silk, which was about as convenient as carrying around a typewriter in a backpack. Paper changed the game, allowing for the spread of literature and bureaucratic documentation at a fraction of the cost and weight. Imagine the relief of the empire's accountants, who could finally ditch those clunky bamboo tablets. But the Han weren't just about stationery and silk. They had a knack for metallurgy that would make any blacksmith jealous. The invention of the blast furnace in the 1st century BCE allowed them to produce cast iron at an unprecedented scale. This wasn't just for show. Those iron plows and tools significantly boosted agricultural productivity, feeding a population that ballooned to around 60 million at its peak. Talk about a culinary challenge, feeding the ancient equivalent of Italy today. Now, while the Han were busy inventing and trading, they were also managing an empire as sprawling as it was diverse. The bureaucratic system they developed was a marvel of organization, with a civil service exam that could rival any SAT. Emperor Wu of Han, reigning from 141 to 87 BCE, expanded the empire's borders while ensuring that his government ran like a well-oiled machine. Although that machine sometimes needed a bit of grease, bribery was as much a part of the bureaucracy as ink and parchment. The Han economy was a complex beast. They implemented state monopolies on salt and iron in 117 BCE to fill the imperial coffers, essentially the ancient equivalent of taxing your morning coffee. These monopolies were as popular as a lead balloon, but crucial for funding military campaigns and infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, the agricultural sector was the backbone, contributing to the empire's wealth and stability. It was a delicate balance, too much taxation, and you'd have a peasant revolt faster than you could say, Great Wall. And speaking of walls, let's tackle the myth of the Great Wall of China as a single, continuous barrier built by a singular visionary. The reality: it was more like a patchwork quilt of fortifications, built over centuries and by various dynasties, with sections dating back to the Warring States period, 475-221 BCE. The Han extended the wall further, but it was less about keeping out invaders and more about controlling trade and migration. Think of it as an ancient toll booth with a side of defense. Cultural exchange during the Han dynasty wasn't always a peaceful affair. The Chimney, a confederation of nomadic tribes to the north, were a constant thorn in the empire's side. Diplomatic marriages and strategic alliances were as common as skirmishes, making the borderlands a real-life Game of Thrones without the dragons, unless you count the ones embroidered on imperial robes. The Han dynasty's influence rippled out to its neighbors, shaping the cultural and political landscapes of Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. This wasn't just a one-way street. The Han adopted elements from those they conquered or traded with, creating a rich tapestry of cultural fusion. It was a bit like a historical potluck, where everyone brought something to the table, whether it was art, religion, or the occasional military tactic. So, while the Romans were busy building roads and aqueducts, the Han were crafting an empire that was equally formidable, with its own set of challenges and triumphs. Their legacy is one of innovation, resilience, and adaptability, a testament to the power of trade and technology in shaping human history. But don't pack your time travel bags just yet. There's still more to unpack as we journey through the twists and turns of ancient history. As we journey back from the bustling crossroads of the Silk Road, it's time to unravel how the legacies of these ancient powerhouses still echo in our modern world. Because, believe it or not, the ancient solutions to their economic woes and societal hiccups are still relevant or stubbornly ignored by us today. Talk about history's persistent boomerang effect. Let's kick things off with Rome, the city that wasn't built in a day but certainly left a legacy that feels eternal. Their penchant for organization and engineering prowess, those aqueducts, roads, and concrete marvels, set a standard that we still admire. Sure, modern cities might not be built with the blood, sweat, and denarii of legions, but the Roman blueprint of infrastructure underpinning empire building is alive and well. Next time you're stuck in traffic on a sprawling highway, tip your hat to the Via Appia, the granddaddy of them all. And as for their administrative acumen, well, let's just say today's tax systems might have taken a few cues from those toga-clad bureaucrats. Taxes on everything from inheritance to imported goods aren't just a Roman relic. They're the fiber of modern governance across the globe. As they say, nothing is certain but death and taxes, and the Romans definitely had both covered, often in the same breath. Jumping over to Egypt, the land of the pharaohs, we're left pondering how their legacy of centralized control and monumental ambition still captivates us. The pyramids stand as timeless symbols of human ingenuity and the power of collective labor. Sure, we're not building stone tombs for our leaders anymore, but the monumental projects of today, like skyscrapers that scrape the sky and bridges that span continents, carry the same whiff of grandeur. The ancient Egyptians understood the importance of resource management and bureaucracy long before it was cool, laying the groundwork for modern administrative states. Their system of record-keeping and resource allocation might seem archaic compared to today's digital databases, but the principle remains. Keep track, plan ahead, and build big. Now, if we shift gears to ancient Greece, we're faced with the irony of their democratic ideals. The Athenians might not have invented democracy as we know it, but they certainly gave it a whirl, albeit with a rather exclusive guest list. Their version of democracy, where only free male citizens got a say, is a far cry from today's inclusive ideals, yet the notion of civic participation they pioneered has endured and evolved into modern democratic systems worldwide. And let's talk about their philosophical legacies. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle have left intellectual footprints that are still visible in modern debates about ethics and governance. Just remember, while the Greeks may have laid the philosophical groundwork, their society was more about exclusion than inclusion, a reality that we continue to grapple with today. Over in China, the Han Dynasty's innovations in technology and trade are still hitting home runs. Paper, the Silk Road, and those early bureaucratic systems have left indelible marks on our modern world. Think about it. Without paper, we wouldn't have books, newspapers, or even the humble sticky note. A nightmare for anyone who loves jotting down random thoughts. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was a cultural superhighway that spread ideas and innovations across continents. Today, global trade networks echo its influence, proving that the Han's blueprint for economic interconnectivity was centuries ahead of its time. But here's the kicker. As much as we admire these ancient giants for their accomplishments, we're also inheriting their unresolved issues. Economic inequality, political power struggles, and societal divisions were as much a part of ancient life as they are today. The Romans struggled with wealth disparity, the Greeks with democratic exclusivity, the Egyptians with resource management, and the Han with bureaucratic inefficiency. Sound familiar? It's almost as if history is gently tapping us on the shoulder, whispering, "You're not as different as you think." And then there's the seductive allure of myths. Despite peeling back the layers to reveal the gritty realities of these civilizations, the legends persist, captivating our imaginations. Whether it's the romanticized gladiator fights of Rome, the mystical allure of Egyptian pyramids, the intellectual utopia of Greece, or the exotic Silk Road adventures of the Han, these stories offer an escape, a chance to dream of a world where heroes and empires loom large. Maybe, just maybe, these myths endure because they remind us of our potential for greatness and folly alike. So, What have we learned from these ancient tales? Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that while the details of human history may change, the core challenges remain remarkably consistent. We're still navigating the complex dance of governance, economy, and society, trying to balance public good with private interest, innovation with tradition, and idealism with pragmatic realities. The ancient world was a cauldron of ideas, conflict, and creativity, and in many ways, we're still cooking with the same ingredients today. As we wrap up our historical detour, let's leave with a thought. If the ancients could see us now, would they be impressed or disappointed? Maybe a bit of both. After all, we've built on their legacies, but we've also inherited their issues. And as we move forward, perhaps the real challenge isn't just to learn from history, but to make sure we're writing a future that would make those ancient architects of civilization proud. Here's to hoping we can do just that, with a little less drama and a lot more wisdom. In the grand theatre of history, where empires rise and fall as predictably as a toddler's mood, ancient calendars stand out as the ultimate comedy of errors. Imagine trying to keep track of time when the universe itself seems to be playing cosmic whack-a-mole with days and nights. That's right. Early attempts at timekeeping were like trying to assemble a flat-pack wardrobe from a certain Swedish furniture giant. Instructions optional, frustration guaranteed. The Egyptians were among the first to take a stab at this Herculean task, and let's just say their approach was as ambitious as building pyramids with a workforce of thousands. Around 3000 BCE, these folks decided that the solar year should be 365 days long. They based this on the annual flooding of the Nile, which was their version of a yearly alarm clock. But while they were busy measuring the river's tantrums, they overlooked a pesky little detail. The actual solar year is 365, 25 days, that extra quarter day. It was like the missing piece of an IKEA puzzle, frustratingly elusive. Enter the intercalary month, an ancient hack that sounds like something you'd find on a life hack blog. The Egyptians, in their wisdom, decided to add 5 extra days at the end of the year, which they dedicated to feasting and festivities, because what better way to deal with a flawed calendar than by throwing a party? But even with these additional days, their calendar drifted from the actual solar year, sliding like a greased eel through history. By the time Cleopatra was charming Julius Caesar, the Egyptian seasons were about as predictable as a lottery draw. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians were having their own calendrical crisis. Their solution, a lunisolar calendar that tried to juggle the solar year and the lunar months. Imagine balancing a spinning plate on a stick while riding a unicycle. That was the Babylonian calendar in a nutshell. They had 12 lunar months, each consisting of 29 or 30 days, which meant their year was about 354 days long. To prevent their calendar from wandering off like a lost sheep, they added an extra month every few years. This was their attempt to sync up with the solar year, a maneuver as graceful as a toddler learning to walk. This extra month, known as Adar Roman II, was inserted 7 times in a 19-year cycle, a system that sounds suspiciously like a math teacher's cruel joke. Yet, despite the complexity, this lunisolar calendar was adopted by many cultures and even influenced the Hebrew and Islamic calendars. Today, the Islamic calendar still follows a purely lunar system, which is why Ramadan floats around the calendar like a celestial game of hopscotch. But why all this fuss over timekeeping, you ask? Well, for ancient civilizations, calendars were not just about marking the passage of time. They were crucial for agriculture, religious ceremonies, and taxation. Basically, the trifecta of ancient life. A miscalculated calendar could mean the difference between a bumper harvest and famine, or a well-timed festival and a no-show deity. And let's not forget the political implications. A ruler who couldn't keep track of time might find themselves dethroned faster than a pharaoh could say, Tutankhamun. Now, while these ancients were busy wrestling with celestial mechanics, they also had to contend with the whims of their gods. After all, when your deities are as capricious as a cat, deciding whether or not to knock a glass off the table, it's little wonder calendars often felt like divine improvisation. The Egyptians, for instance, believed their 5 intercalary days were the birthdays of gods like Osiris and Isis. A clever way to justify calendar errors, perhaps, or simply a divine excuse to party. In Mesopotamia, the Babylonians linked their calendar to the phases of the moon and the movements of the sun, which they believed were governed by the gods. This was a world where celestial events were interpreted as divine messages. A solar eclipse could spell doom, while a full moon was as auspicious as finding an extra slice of pizza in the box. It's not hard to see why they went to such lengths to interpret the heavens. Yet, for all their attempts at celestial order, ancient calendars remained stubbornly chaotic. The Egyptians and Babylonians did their best with the knowledge and tools they had, but the universe had other plans. The Earth's rotation wobbled, the moon's orbit shifted, and the solar year refused to conform to human precision. It was a cosmic dance that defied rhythm, and the ancient world was left to keep pace as best it could. So, next time you glance at your smartphone calendar, take a moment to appreciate the chaos and creativity behind its predecessors. Ancient calendars may have been a mess, but they were also a testament to humanity's enduring quest to make sense of the stars. And as any historian will tell you, it's a quest that's far from over. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that time waits for no one, not even the Egyptians or Babylonians. The ancient world was a bit like a cosmic game of musical chairs, except the music was offbeat, and the chairs kept disappearing. While calendars served as the soundtrack to agricultural rhythms, they were often as reliable as a politician's promise. Let's dive into the economic impact of these misaligned timekeepers, where the stakes were less about missing a dinner reservation and more about feeding an entire civilization. Picture Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where agriculture wasn't just a way of life, it was life. Mesopotamians depended on their crops like a modern millennial depends on Wi-Fi. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers weren't just geographic features. They were the lifeblood of the region, providing fertile soil through annual floods. Timing these floods was as crucial as timing your entrance to a surprise party. Too early, and you drown your crops in a watery grave. Too late, and they'd be as parched as a desert. Enter the Babylonian lunisolar calendar, which balanced its 354-day year with the occasional leap month, like throwing a lifebuoy to a drowning man. This calendar was a farmer's best friend, or worst enemy, depending on how well it predicted the floods. A miscalculation could lead to either famine or surplus, akin to ordering 500 pizzas for a party of 5. The economic impact was profound. A surplus could drive prices down, leading to economic instability, while a shortage could mean starvation and social unrest. It's like a high-stakes poker game where the ante was civilization itself. The Babylonians weren't the only ones rolling the dice with time. Across the Mediterranean, Egyptians relied on their 365-day calendar, which, despite its flaws, was tied to the annual inundation of the Nile. This inundation was their agricultural clock, as predictable as the sunrise, or so they hoped. When the calendar drifted, the Egyptians found themselves in a bind. Either the floods came too late, leading to a shortfall of grain, or they came too early, causing crops to rot. Imagine betting your entire economy on a river's mood swings. That's the kind of gamble they took. But here's the kicker. These calendars weren't just economic tools, they were political weapons. In Mesopotamia, the priestly class held the keys to the calendar, wielding it like a mystical staff. Their ability to predict celestial events and agricultural cycles elevated their status, turning them into kingmakers. The right prediction could solidify a ruler's power, while a blunder might lead to their downfall. It was like playing a Game of Thrones with the stars as your allies or adversaries. The economic ramifications extended beyond borders, influencing trade and societal stability. In a world where grain was currency, a misaligned calendar could ripple through the economy like a stone thrown into a pond. A bumper crop in one region might flood the market, causing prices to plummet and trade routes to shift. Conversely, a poor harvest could lead to increased demand and higher prices, straining political alliances. It's a reminder that even the ancients knew that when it came to agriculture, timing was everything. The stakes were high, and the consequences were dire. Inadequate timekeeping could lead to a society's collapse, a fate that befell more than one ancient civilization. Take the Minoans, for instance, whose reliance on agriculture and trade made them vulnerable to the whims of nature and the heavens. A miscalculation in their calendar could spell disaster, and some historians believe that a series of such miscalculations contributed to their decline. It's a harsh lesson in the fragility of human endeavors. a reminder that no matter how advanced we think we are, we're all at the mercy of forces beyond our control. As we wrap up this exploration of ancient timekeeping's economic impact, let's not forget the human element. These calendars weren't just abstract constructs. They were the result of human ingenuity, trial, and error. They were as much about survival as they were about understanding the universe, a noble pursuit fraught with challenges and triumphs. It's a testament to humanity's resilience and creativity, a reminder that even in the face of insurmountable odds, keep striving to understand our place in the cosmos. So, while we may chuckle at the ancients' cosmic misadventures, let's also acknowledge the lessons they offer. In a world where a misplaced decimal point can lead to financial ruin, their struggles with timekeeping remind us of the precarious balance between chaos and order, a balance we still strive to maintain in our modern world. As we continue our journey through the annals of history, let's carry these lessons with us, a reminder that while the past may be distant, its echoes continue to resonate in our lives today. And so, as the echoes of ancient timekeeping chaos continue to reverberate, we find ourselves plunging headfirst into the political circus that was the Roman calendar. Cue the entrance of Julius Caesar, the original calendar reformer. Now, if you think juggling leap years and daylight saving time is complicated, try keeping an empire in check when your calendar is more scrambled than breakfast eggs. Before Caesar took a stab, pun intended, at reforming the Roman calendar, the system was in shambles. The pre-Julian Roman calendar was a hodgepodge of lunar months and political expediency, with a year that had about as much consistency as a politician's promises. Originally, the Roman year was 355 days long, divided into 12 months. To keep things from drifting too far off course, an extra month called Mercedonius was occasionally added, essentially at the whim of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. This meant the calendar was more of a political tool than a timekeeping device, manipulated to extend a political term or cut it short. Enter Julius Caesar in 46 BCE, who decided enough was enough. Inspired by his time in Egypt, and perhaps a little tired of the calendar chaos, Caesar consulted the astronomer Sarsigenes of Alexandria. Together, they devised the Julian calendar, a solar calendar that abandoned the moon's shifty whims in favor of the more stable sun. The new calendar featured a year of 365 days, with an extra day tacked on every 4 years, giving birth to the leap year. It was like swapping out your old horse-drawn cart for a shiny new chariot. The Julian calendar was implemented with a bit of drama, as you'd expect in Rome. The year 46 BCE became known as the Year of Confusion, stretching a ridiculous 445 days long to realign the calendar with the solar year. Talk about a long year, plenty of time for Caesar to consolidate power and remind Rome who was in charge. This was more than just a timekeeping correction. It was a calculated political maneuver. By straightening out the calendar, Caesar was essentially declaring himself the master of time, a formidable position that reinforced his authority. Now, don't get too swept away by the romance of Caesar's calendar coup. The Julian calendar wasn't perfect, accumulating an error of about 11 minutes per year. That might not sound like much, but over centuries, those minutes added up like forgotten credit card interest. Fast forward to the 16th century, and the spring equinox was sliding into March 11th, prompting Pope Gregory Roman XIII to intervene with his own reform, but that's a story for another day. For Caesar, the calendar was a chessboard, and he played it like a grandmaster. By controlling the very fabric of time, he could extend his influence over the Roman Senate and the people. It was a masterclass in political optics, a reminder that in Rome, as in life, the appearance of control was just as important as the reality. And while Caesar himself ended up on the wrong end of a dagger not long after, his calendar lived on, a testament to the enduring power of a well-timed reform. But let's not forget the economic ripple effects of this calendrical overhaul. The Julian calendar provided a more reliable framework for agriculture and commerce, stabilizing the Roman economy in a way that previous calendars had failed to achieve. Farmers could better predict planting and harvest times, reducing the risk of famine. Traders could plan their routes with greater certainty, knowing that months wouldn't be arbitrarily extended or shortened. It was a boon for commerce and a pillar of Rome's imperial strength. This wasn't just administrative efficiency, it was a political statement. By imposing order on the calendar, Caesar was making a bold claim. Rome was the center of the world, and he was its son. The Julian calendar was a reflection of Roman supremacy, an assertion that time itself was subject to the will of the empire. It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools, like a calendar, can wield the greatest power. However, the calendar's adoption wasn't without its critics and hiccups. Old habits die hard, and many Romans struggled with the new system. Some officials, either through ignorance or obstinacy, continued to miscalculate leap years, leading to further confusion. But over time, the Julian calendar prevailed, thanks in part to its elegance and simplicity, a testament to the enduring appeal of a good idea, even in the face of bureaucratic inertia. As the Julian calendar spread beyond Rome, it became a cornerstone of Western civilization, influencing timekeeping across Europe and beyond. It's a legacy that underscores the interconnectedness of power, time, and culture, a reminder that history isn't just a series of disconnected events, but a tapestry woven from countless threads. And so, as we look back on Caesar's calendrical coup, let's appreciate the audacity of his vision. In a world where time was often as nebulous as a politician's promise, Caesar dared to bring order to chaos, reshaping the very fabric of reality to suit his empire's needs. It's a lesson in the power of innovation, a reminder that even the simplest changes can have profound and lasting impacts. As we leave this chapter of timekeeping turbulence, remember that history is full of such moments, times when individuals dared to challenge the status quo, leaving an indelible mark on the world. It's a testament to the power of human ingenuity, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, we can reshape the world to suit our needs. And though Caesar's reign was cut short, his calendar lived on, a tribute to the enduring power of a well-timed reform. And speaking of reshaping the world, let's dive into the delightful chaos of ancient timekeeping's social implications. Imagine a world where your favorite festival could fall on a random Tuesday instead of the expected Saturday, and your guard seemed as capricious as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. That's right, folks. Ancient festivals and celestial events were often more out of sync than a karaoke performance after too many drinks. In the ancient world, keeping up with the divine schedule was serious business. These societies weren't just marking time. They were trying to align their earthly celebrations with the cosmic dance of the stars and planets. But when your calendar is more slippery than a politician's ethics, that's easier said than done. Take the Egyptians, for instance. Their calendar, with its extra 5 days tacked on for good measure, often led to festivals that drifted off course like a boat with a broken rudder. This calendrical drift wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a spiritual crisis waiting to happen. Religious festivals were the glue that held society together, the tick-tocks of their day, if you will, events everyone looked forward to, talked about, and participated in. But when the stars didn't align with the party schedule, it was like showing up for a surprise birthday party and realizing you're a week early. Awkward, right? For the Egyptians, whose entire worldview was tied to the cycles of the Nile and the heavens, getting the dates wrong could spell disaster. Their deities were demanding and had a reputation to maintain. Imagine the grumbling if the festival of Apit, meant to honor the god Ammon and ensure the flooding of the Nile, happened when the river was as dry as a pharaoh's sense of humor. The priests, those ancient event planners, were left scrambling to justify the mix-up with divine excuses more creative than a schoolchild's dog-ate-my-homework routine. Over in Mesopotamia, things weren't much better. The Babylonians, with their lunisolar calendar, had a system as intricate as a Game of Thrones plotline. Yet, despite their best efforts, they still managed to misalign their religious observances with celestial events, often enough to make a difference. Picture a New Year's celebration ringing in spring when winter still had a tight grip, or a harvest festival with not a ripe crop in sight. The resulting confusion could undermine the very fabric of their religious life, as the timing of these events was believed to influence the favor of the gods. When gods' parties were scheduled for the wrong day, the fallout was more than just a logistical headache. It was a spiritual conundrum that could unsettle the masses faster than you can say divine displeasure. People looked to their leaders and religious authorities for stability and harmony with the heavens, but when those authorities couldn't even get the date right, trust in their divine connection could wane. It was like finding out your favorite influencer doesn't actually use the products they promote. Disillusionment City. The stakes were high. A mistimed festival could lead to poor harvests, bad weather, or even military defeats, all seen as signs of divine disfavor. The priests, those ancient spin doctors, had to work overtime, crafting narratives that would keep the populace calm and the guards appeased. They'd shuffle ceremonial dates around, sometimes with the deftness of a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat, hoping no one would notice the celestial sleight of hand. And let's not forget about the common folk, who bore the brunt of these calendrical shenanigans. For them, religious festivals were a chance to blow off steam, to dance, feast, and generally forget about the drudgery of daily life. Now imagine the frustration when these much-needed breaks were rescheduled or cancelled because of a calendar that seemed to have a mind of its own. It was like looking forward to a long weekend only to find out your boss decided the company doesn't observe public holidays after all. But why did these societies put up with such unreliable timekeeping? Well, the truth is, they didn't have much choice. The complexity of celestial mechanics was beyond their grasp, and their attempts to keep time were as much about maintaining cosmic order as they were about practicality. It was a balancing act between the known and the unknown, a dance with the divine where they were always one step behind. In this uncertain world, the priests and rulers who could best navigate the cosmic chaos found themselves in positions of power. They became the gatekeepers of divine favor, wielding their calendrical knowledge like a talisman. But with great power came great responsibility, and the pressure to get it right was immense. A single misstep could turn a revered figure into a scapegoat faster than you can say celestial miscalculation. So, next time, you set a reminder on your phone for a friend's birthday. Spare a thought for those ancient priests, juggling celestial events like a circus performer with one too many balls in the air. Their struggle to keep time in sync with the heavens was as much about survival as it was about spirituality. It was a reminder that, even in the ancient world, timing was everything. And while we may have advanced beyond their rudimentary calendars, their quest to order the cosmos still echoes in our modern obsession with precision and predictability. As we move forward in our exploration of ancient timekeeping, let's remember the lessons of those celestial misadventures. They reveal a universal truth. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Whether it's a misaligned festival or a modern-day scheduling snafu, we're all just trying to make sense of the time we have. So, let's embrace the chaos, learn from the past, and keep striving for harmony with the stars. Stay tuned for our final chapter, where we'll dive into the lasting legacy of these ancient calendars and how their echoes continue to shape our world today. Until then, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet on the ground, because, as history has shown us, you never know when the next cosmic curveball might come your way. And so, as we turn the final page on our epic journey through the cosmos of ancient timekeeping, let's pause to marvel at how these chaotic calendars laid the groundwork for the orderly timekeepers we carry around in our pockets today. The legacy of these early systems may not be as glamorous as a gladiator's triumph in the Colosseum, but their impact on modern society is as pervasive as the Roman Empire at its peak. Fast forward a few millennia, and here we are, living in a world where time is sliced and diced into neat little packages. A 24-hour day, a 7-day week, and a 365-day year, with a leap year thrown in every 4 years for good measure. It's a system so ingrained in our lives that we often forget its roots are tangled in the starry skies of antiquity. Our trusty Gregorian calendar, the one we rely on to plan everything from haircuts to holiday trips, owes its existence to the reforms of Pope Gregory Roman XIII in 1582. His tweak to the Julian calendar, shaving off 10 days to realign the spring equinox, was more than just a celestial tidying up exercise. It was a political and religious maneuver to ensure Easter was celebrated at the right time. Because let's face it, no one wants their chocolate eggs delivered a week late. But why, you ask, did this matter so much? Well, in a world where religion and state were as entwined as a bowl of spaghetti, the timing of religious festivals was a serious affair. The stability of society, the rhythm of agriculture, and even the flow of commerce were all pegged to the calendar. Misalignments could lead to economic chaos, as seen when markets opened on holy days or harvests missed their mark. It's a tale as old as time, or at least as old as the time when people started noticing the sun's stubborn refusal to conform to a tidy 365-day loop. Now, as much as we like to think we're the masters of time, the truth is, we're still grappling with its mysteries. Our atomic clocks might be accurate to within a billionth of a second, but they can't stop time from playing its cosmic tricks on us. The Earth's rotation is gradually slowing, thanks to the gravitational tango with the moon, which means that every so often we have to throw in a leap second to keep our clocks in sync with the planet's pirouette. It's like the universe's way of reminding us that, no matter how precise we get, time is still just a dance partner with a penchant for improvisation. And speaking of improvisation, let's not forget the delightful mess that is daylight saving time. Introduced in the early 20th century as a way to make better use of daylight and save energy, it's a twice-yearly reminder of our ongoing struggle to bend time to our will. For about 70 countries around the globe, the biannual clock change is a chance to experience a mini jet lag without leaving home, all in the name of efficiency. Yet, like a stubborn cat refusing to be herded, the benefits of daylight saving time are as elusive as the perfect cup of coffee, leaving many to question if it's more trouble than it's worth. But here's the kicker. For all our technological advancements, our attempts to tame time are just as much about human nature as they are about celestial mechanics. We crave order and predictability in a world that's anything but. Whether it's the ancient Egyptians trying to align their calendar with the Nile's floods, or modern humans syncing their schedules with the sun's rise and fall, our quest to master time is a reflection of our desire for control in an unpredictable universe. This brings us to the heart of the matter. Time may be a construct, but it's our construct. It's a framework we've built to bring some semblance of order to the cosmic chaos, a way to measure our days and make sense of the vast, indifferent universe. The calendars of ancient civilizations, with their quirks and miscalculations, were the first steps on this journey, a testament to humanity's relentless curiosity and ingenuity. So, as we wrap up our chronicle through the annals of timekeeping, let's take a moment to appreciate the legacy of those ancient calendar architects. Their struggles and triumphs laid the foundation for the systems we rely on today, a reminder that even in the face of insurmountable odds, human determination can bend the arc of history. Their legacy is etched in every clock tick and calendar page, a tribute to the enduring power of human innovation. In the end, the story of timekeeping is a reflection of the human spirit, a testament to our ability to adapt, innovate, and strive for understanding in a world that often seems beyond comprehension. It's a journey that continues to this day as we push the boundaries of science and technology in our quest to tame the cosmic clockwork. And while we may never fully master time, our efforts to do so are a reminder of what it means to be human, to reach for the stars, even when they seem impossibly far away. So, dear listener, as you set your alarm for tomorrow morning or plan your next getaway, remember the celestial journey that brought us here. From the pyramids of Egypt to the bustling streets of Rome, from the observatories of ancient Babylonia to the atomic clocks of today, timekeeping is a saga of human ambition and creativity. It's a reminder that, while the universe might not always play by our rules, our attempts to impose order on its chaos are what make us uniquely, wonderfully human. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the history of timekeeping, a tale of celestial misadventures and human triumphs, a dance with the divine that echoes through the ages. As you drift off to sleep with this newfound knowledge, may your dreams be filled with the stars and stories of those who came before us, charting a course through the cosmos with nothing but their wits and a few pieces of parchment. Sweet dreams, and may your time always be well spent. Early morning in ancient Mesopotamia probably wasn't much different from your average Monday. Only instead of hitting the snooze button on smartphones, folks were likely waking up to the gentle, yet insistent, bleating of goats. Welcome to the cradle of civilization, where the Sumerians were busy inventing the very concept of urban life. Forget the romanticized, bucolic vision of yore. These were the first folks to trade in the tranquility of the countryside for the hustle and bustle of city living. And what a scene it was. We're talking about Uruk, circa 4000 BCE, a sprawling metropolis for its time, teeming with roughly 50,000 souls. By today's standards, That's a small town, but back then it was practically Manhattan. The Sumerians were the original overachievers, and let's be honest, they probably invented the first version of an office job. Picture it, a weary scribe hunched over a clay tablet, scratching out cuneiform symbols with a reed stylus. This wasn't just doodling for fun, this was the birth of writing. Think of it as the ancient world's answer to email, the first step towards the mountain of paperwork we know and love today. And what did they write about? Taxes, of course. Because even 5,000 years ago, death and taxes were the only certainties. Now, while the Sumerians weren't exactly tweeting, they were laying down the foundation for everything from epic poetry to legal codes. The Epic of Gilgamesh, anyone. It's like the ancient version of a blockbuster movie script, complete with drama, romance, and a flood narrative that predates the biblical one by centuries. But let's not get too caught up in romantic notions. The reality was probably less about heroic quests and more about figuring out whose goat wandered into whose field. Speaking of economics, let's dive into the gritty details. Barter was the name of the game, and it was as cumbersome as it sounds. Imagine trading a cow for a stack of grain. Sounds straightforward, right? But what if the cow's owner thought their beast was worth 3 times that amount? Enter currency. The Sumerians didn't have coins, but they did have barley, which served as a kind of proto-money. Barley was the Bitcoin of its day, a universal medium that smoothed out the rough edges of barter. It wasn't until later that metal coins would jingle in the pockets of the ancient elite. But for now, barley was king. And let's not forget the political machinations. These early cities were more like city-states, each with its own ruler. King Gilgamesh of Uruk, for instance, wasn't just a mythic hero, but a very real ruler, albeit one who might have had a problem with ego. Imagine a city council meeting where the main agenda item was whether or not the king could claim divine heritage. Spoiler, he probably did. But what about the common folk? While kings were busy building ziggurats, the ancient equivalent of skyscrapers, ordinary citizens were eking out a living in an unforgiving landscape. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were the lifeblood of the region, but they were also unpredictable, prone to flooding without notice. It was feast or famine, literally. Irrigation was a game-changer here, allowing for agriculture that supported large populations and consequently the rise of cities. Without irrigation, Mesopotamian civilization might have been a non-starter. Let's not ignore the gossip mill, either. In a world without tabloids, word of mouth was everything. Did you hear about Enkidu's wild antics before he got civilized by the love of a good woman? Or Gilgamesh's questionable leadership decisions? These stories passed from ear to ear, growing more elaborate with each retelling, much like today's viral tweets. History might remember the kings, but it was the stories that kept people entertained around the ancient equivalent of the water cooler. Now, were there myths? Oh, absolutely. The notion of a perfect, harmonious past where everyone lived in peace is as much a fairy tale now as it was then. The Sumerians were as human as we are, full of ambition, flaws, and a penchant for drama. They didn't just invent writing and cities. They also laid the groundwork for the rise of empires, with all the intrigue and power struggles that entails. But that's a tale for another day. For now, let's just appreciate that the next time you gripe about office politics or rush hour traffic, you're participating in a tradition that's as old as civilization itself. So, from the bustling streets of Uruk, let's grab our metaphorical passports and hop across the Mediterranean Sea to a land where the skyline was dominated not by ziggurats, but by something even more monumental, pyramids. Welcome to ancient Egypt, where pharaohs ruled with divine authority, and their tombs were nothing short of architectural wonders. But before you start picturing romantic scenes of majestic structures rising effortlessly from the desert sands, let's splash a bit of cold reality on that dreamy picture. First, let's talk logistics. Building a pyramid wasn't just a matter of piling up some stones and calling it a day. Oh no, it was more like running the world's most ambitious construction project without the help of modern conveniences like cranes or forklifts. The Great Pyramid of Giza, by the way, weighs in at a casual 6 million tons and stands at a towering 481 feet. If you think that's impressive, consider this. It took roughly 20 years to complete, employing as many as 20,000 to 30,000 laborers, who, spoiler alert, weren't slaves but skilled workers. Yes, you heard right. Those pyramid builders were salaried workers, not shackled captives. Myth-busting 101, folks. These laborers were paid in beer and bread, which sounds like the ultimate workplace perk, until you realize that beer was more of a necessity than a luxury. It was safer to drink than the water, which, thanks to the Nile, was often a murky concoction of who knows what. Picture it as the ancient equivalent of free office coffee, only mandatory for survival. So, if you ever feel like your job is thankless, imagine hauling limestone blocks up ramps in the scorching Egyptian sun. Now that's a workout regime that CrossFit could only dream of. Speaking of those limestone blocks, let's dive into the mechanics. Each block weighed between 2 and 15 tons. How did they move these behemoths? Forget wheels or magic. It was down to good old-fashioned manpower and ingenuity. Workers likely used sleds and water to reduce friction on sand, a technique confirmed by both ancient drawings and modern experiments. This wasn't just brute strength, but a feat of coordination and engineering prowess. And while we're debunking myths, let's ditch the image of aliens lending a hand. It was human sweat and skill that raised these colossal structures. Now, onto the pyramids themselves. These weren't just oversized tombs. They were the ultimate status symbols, the ancient Egyptian version of a luxury high-rise or a billionaire's yacht. Each one was a testament to the pharaoh's power and a bid for immortality. What better way to ensure you're remembered through the ages than by commissioning a monument visible from miles away? Of course, this grandeur came with its own set of problems. Maintaining a workforce of thousands required efficient resource management, and it wasn't just about feeding them. It also involved ensuring loyalty and morale, a task as monumental as the pyramids themselves. But let's not gloss over the drama behind these architectural marvels. The pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were guard kings, and their reigns were filled with enough intrigue to rival any modern soap opera. Family feuds, betrayals, and power struggles were the order of the day. Take Pharaoh Akhenaten, for example, who turned the religious establishment on its head by promoting the worship of a single deity, Aten, the sun disk. Talk about shaking things up. His reign was a dramatic departure from tradition, and his successor, the famous boy king Tutankhamun, had to spend a good chunk of his short reign restoring the old ways. And who could forget the legendary love story of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, followed by her infamous liaison with Mark Antony? Cleopatra wasn't just a pretty face. She was a shrewd politician who knew how to wield power and influence. Her life was a blend of romance and ruthlessness, a reminder that power in the ancient world was as much about strategy as it was about lineage. While the pharaohs were busy managing their divine image and familial intrigues, the average Egyptian was more concerned with the cycles of the Nile. The river, with its annual inundation, was the lifeblood of the civilization, dictating agricultural cycles, and by extension, the entire economy. The Nile's predictable flooding provided the fertile soil that supported a burgeoning population and a thriving society. It was the original irrigation system, a natural gift that needed careful management to maximize its potential. Yet, for all its predictability, life along the Nile wasn't all sunshine and lotus flowers. It was a delicate balance, and any disruption, whether from poor floods, political strife, or external threats, could spell disaster. This was a civilization that thrived on stability, yet was no stranger to upheaval. As we peel back the layers of ancient Egypt, we find a society as complex and nuanced as any today. It was a place where divine authority met human ambition, where monumental architecture was both a testament to power and a public works project of staggering proportions. And while the pyramids stand as a testament to ancient Egypt's grandeur, the stories behind their construction reveal a world that was both extraordinary and deeply human. So, next time you gaze upon these ancient wonders, remember, they're more than just stone and geometry. They are the culmination of political ambition, economic necessity, and human ingenuity, a legacy that continues to captivate our imagination and challenge our understanding. But don't get too comfortable. There's plenty more to uncover as we continue our journey through the sands of time. Stay tuned for more tales of ambition, intrigue, and the occasional royal scandal as we delve deeper into the annals of history. As we leave the towering pyramids behind and set sail across the Mediterranean, let's time travel to a place where marble columns were more fashionable than gold tombs. Ancient Greece. Ah, Greece. the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and a surprisingly high number of myths about men in togas. But before we start romanticizing ancient Athens as some kind of proto-hipster paradise, let's set the record straight about who really got to enjoy this so-called cradle of democracy. Spoiler alert. If you weren't a free male citizen, your voice in the assembly was about as significant as a whisper in a hurricane. Democracy in Athens was revolutionary, if you fit the narrow criteria to participate. Of a population of roughly 300,000, only about 30,000 were eligible to cast a vote. That's right. The Athenian version of rule by the people excluded women, slaves, and resident aliens known as medics. Think of it as a very exclusive club where membership was determined by birthright rather than merit. And while the idea of democracy was groundbreaking, the execution was less so. Imagine trying to get anything done at a city council meeting with thousands of attendees, each eager to shout their opinion. It was less like a rational debate and more like a rowdy town hall meeting on steroids. But let's not throw democracy out with the bathwater. Athenian democracy did have its merits, including a system of lottery to select public officials, which was their attempt to curb corruption. Sounds like a game of chance, but hey, the Athenians figured was better than letting the richest guy buy his way into power. And while the assembly was open to any citizen who could drag himself up the Phoenix Hill, the real work was done in smaller, more focused councils. These were like the committees of modern parliaments, tasked with the nitty-gritty of governance. Meanwhile, across the Peloponnesian Peninsula, the Spartans were living life on their own terms. Picture Sparta. You might think of chiseled warriors with washboard abs. But before you start envying their fitness regimen, consider the real cost of the Spartan lifestyle. Spartans were raised from birth to be soldiers, their lives dictated by the state, in a system that valued military prowess above all else. Boys were taken from their families at the tender age of 7 to begin their grueling training in the agoge, a rigorous program that included everything from wrestling to survival skills. No room for childhood dreams here, unless those dreams involved becoming a human weapon. However, let's not be too quick to idolize the Spartans as paragons of discipline. Their society was built on the backs of helots, essentially serfs, who worked the land and provided food for the Spartan elite. The helots outnumbered the Spartans, and their treatment was less than humane, subjected to harsh control measures and even ritualized killings to prevent uprisings. So much for the harmonious warrior society. Underneath the armor, Sparta was a powder keg of social tension. And while we're on the subject of myths, let's tackle a big one. The Spartan phalanx wasn't an invincible force of nature. Sure, their military was formidable, but it wasn't foolproof. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE saw the Thebans, led by the brilliant general Epaminondas, shatter the Spartan supremacy with innovative tactics. It was a classic case of brains over brawn, proving that even the mightiest warriors can fall when faced with clever strategy. Back in Athens, the theater of democracy had its own dramas, and I'm not just talking about the tragedies penned by Sophocles. The real cost of Athenian democracy was its reliance on an empire that stretched across the Aegean Sea. The Delian League, ostensibly an alliance for mutual defense against Persia, was more like a protection racket, with Athens demanding tribute from member states. This influx of wealth funded public works, cultural projects, and naturally, a formidable navy. It also bred resentment and rivalries, culminating in the Peloponnesian War, a drawn-out conflict that left Athens a shadow of its former glory. Speaking of glory, let's debunk the myth of Athenian culture as a model of perfection. Sure, they gave us Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but their society was also rife with contradictions. While they debated the nature of justice and virtue, they also maintained a system where women were largely confined to the home and foreign residents contributed to the economy without enjoying full rights. It's a reminder that even the brightest societies can have shadows lurking behind their marble facades. Yet, despite these contradictions, the legacy of ancient Greece is undeniable. Their experiments in governance, philosophy, and art laid the foundations for Western civilization. But let's not forget that the ideas that emerged from Athens and Sparta were often products of necessity as much as innovation. The political and social structures were responses to the challenges of their time, not timeless ideals. And while we can admire the achievements of these ancient societies, it's important to see them in context, with all their flaws and imperfections. So, as we continue our journey through history, let's keep our eyes peeled for the myths and realities that shape our understanding of the past. The tale of ancient Greece is far from over, and as we delve deeper, we'll uncover more stories that challenge our perceptions and illuminate the world that was. Stay tuned for more intrigue, innovation, and the occasional philosophical conundrum as we unravel the tapestry of history, one thread at a time. As we sail away from the philosophical shores of Greece, let's dock at the bustling harbors of Rome, where the toga-clad citizens were busy constructing an empire that would make even the most ambitious modern superpower green with envy. Here, the Romans were laying down more than just cobblestones. They were setting the foundation for a civilization that would stretch from the windswept edges of Britannia to the sun-drenched banks of the Nile. Before we get too caught up in the glory of Rome's architectural marvels, let's take a closer look at the nuts and bolts, or rather, bricks and mortar, of their empire-building strategy. First up, roads. The Romans were to roads what Steve Jobs was to smartphones. Not the first in the game, but they certainly perfected it. At the height of their empire, Rome boasted a staggering 250,000 miles of roads. That's enough to circle the globe 10 times. These weren't just any dirt paths. We're talking about meticulously constructed thoroughfares that could withstand the wear and tear of Roman legions, pack animals, and those all-important chariots. The expression, "all roads lead to Rome," wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a logistical reality. Roads were Rome's secret weapon, allowing for rapid military deployment and efficient trade across vast distances. In building these roads, the Romans weren't above borrowing a good idea. Their knack for adopting and adapting the best bits from the cultures they conquered was legendary. Take the Etruscans, for example, from whom the Romans learned the art of road engineering, and let's be honest, a good portion of their cultural mojo. While the Romans might have been the ultimate remix artists, it was their ability to integrate these elements into their own society that truly set them apart. Now, let's talk aqueducts, those grand stone arches that brought water to the city like an ancient version of indoor plumbing. The Romans constructed over 500 miles of aqueducts, with nearly 30 miles above ground, to serve the city of Rome itself. This hydraulic network was essential for maintaining the sprawling metropolis, allowing for public baths, fountains, and yes, the notorious Roman baths where gossip flowed as freely as the water. If you've ever griped about your water bill, spare a thought for the engineers who ensured that Rome's million-plus inhabitants had steady access to water, a feat that would make any modern city planner break out in a cold sweat. Behind the glittering facade of marble temples and bustling forums lay the immensely complex Roman economy. At its core was a delicate balance between the opulent lifestyles of the elite and the gritty existence of the common soldier. Senators lounged in their villas, sipping wine and discussing politics, while the vast majority of Rome's populace was more concerned with the price of bread and the next payday. Speaking of pay, let's dive into the financial reality faced by the Roman legionaries, those ironclad men who expanded and protected the empire. Roman soldiers were the backbone of the empire, but their compensation was hardly extravagant. Legionaries' pay was roughly 225 denarii a year around the time of Augustus. To put that in perspective, 1 denarius was about a day's wage for a laborer. Even with bonuses known as donativa, given at the emperor's discretion, soldiers often had to rely on loot and spoils from campaigns to make ends meet. And while military service offered a path to Roman citizenship and land grants upon retirement, it was no picnic. The discipline was harsh, the conditions brutal, and the risk of death ever present. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the senators were living it up with lavish banquets that would make a buffet at Caesar's palace look like a modest affair. These elites could afford the finest silks imported from the East and the most exquisite wine from the Mediterranean. But this opulence came at a cost. The wealth disparity was glaring, with the elite controlling vast swaths of the economy, while the plebeians, the common folk, struggled to keep their heads above water. Sound familiar? The economic divide is a tale as old as time. Now, let's shift gears to the entertainment scene in Rome, which brings us to the myths of gladiators. Picture a roaring Colosseum, the crowd's cheers echoing off the marble walls as gladiators fought for their lives. It was the ancient world's version of a reality TV spectacle, complete with the same mix of fascination and moral ambiguity. But here's the thing. While gladiators are often romanticized as noble warriors, the reality was far more complex. Many were slaves or prisoners of war, forced into combat as a form of punishment or profit for their owners. Sure, a few rose to fame and fortune, earning their freedom through skill and bravery, but for most, the gladiatorial games were a brutal and often fatal occupation. These events weren't just mindless violence, they were a form of social control. By providing the masses with free entertainment, the emperors could distract the populace from political grievances and economic hardships. Bread and circuses, they called it, keep the stomach full and the mind entertained, and the empire runs smoothly. It was a strategy that worked remarkably well, though at a considerable moral cost. And speaking of moral costs, let's tackle one of the juiciest myths about ancient Rome, the infamous orgies. Popular culture has painted a picture of decadent parties where wine flowed like water and inhibitions were left at the door. But how accurate is this image? While there certainly were extravagant gatherings, the notion of regular debauchery is largely exaggerated. These rumors were often spread by Rome's enemies or later historians eager to depict the empire as morally corrupt. In truth, most Roman social gatherings were more about networking and political maneuvering than hedonism. Yet, the idea of Roman excess has endured, partly because it captures the imagination, and partly because it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of decadence. It's a reminder that history is often shaped by the stories we choose to tell and the myths we choose to believe. As we peel back the layers of Roman society, we find a civilization built on innovation, adaptation, and more than a little opportunism. The empire's grandeur was matched only by its complexity, a testament to the ingenuity and ambition of its people. But for all their achievements, the Romans were not immune to the pitfalls of power, a lesson as relevant today as it was 2 millennia ago. So, as we continue our journey through the annals of history, let's keep our minds open and our curiosity piqued. The story of Rome is far from over, and there's plenty more to explore, from the political machinations of the Senate to the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the rise and fall of one of history's greatest empires, uncovering the truths behind the legends and the realities behind the myths. But even the mightiest empires eventually face their twilight. As Rome's grandeur began to fade, the causes of its decline were as complicated as a Roman senator's toga. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE was less of a sudden collapse and more like a crumbling over time, with barbarians, economic woes, and a few too many political blunders playing tag team to bring down the giant. Let's start with the economy, because money, or the lack of it, makes the empire go round. Rome's coffers were emptier than a gladiator's retirement fund, thanks to various factors, including overextended military campaigns that were costing a pretty penny. The empire's vast borders required a standing army that was as expensive as it was necessary. By the 4th century, the Roman currency had depreciated so much that it might as well have been monopoly money. Inflation was rampant, and the once mighty denarius had about as much value as a promise from a dodgy used chariot salesman. Compounding the problem was the empire's over-reliance on slave labor, which stifled innovation and kept wages low. Slaves were the backbone of the Roman economy, working the fields, mines, and households. As Rome expanded, it brought back more and more captives to fill these roles. But as the empire stopped expanding, the supply of new slaves dwindled, hitting the economy like a chariot running into a wall. Without the constant influx of cheap labor, the system began to wobble. And let's not forget the barbarians at the gates. Rome's borders were like a sieve, with various tribes poking and prodding for weaknesses. The Goths, Vandals, Huns, and others weren't so much a unified force as a bunch of opportunistic neighbors noticing that the big guy on the block was looking a bit shaky. In 410 C, the Visigoths under King Alaric famously sacked Rome. It wasn't the first time the city had been invaded, but it was a psychological blow, a clear sign that Rome's invincibility was more myth than reality. Then there were the internal politics, as tangled and treacherous as a Roman intrigue drama. The empire was effectively split in two in 285 CE by Emperor Diocletian in an attempt to make it more manageable, like cutting a pizza to share. The Western Roman Empire was left to fend for itself, while the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, continued to thrive. This division didn't help the West, which was already struggling with a lack of strong leadership. Imagine a relay race where the baton is constantly dropped. That was Roman politics in its waning years. In 476 C, the last Roman emperor of the West, the poetically named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. It was less an epic battle and more like someone quietly switching off the lights. With the Western Roman Empire's fall, the stage was set for what we often call the Dark Ages. But let's bust this myth wide open. The Dark Ages weren't all doom and gloom. Sure, there was no centralized government like the Empire to keep things ticking, but it wasn't the end of civilization. It was more like hitting the reset button on a video game. Chaotic, yes, but also brimming with potential. Economically, Europe was a patchwork quilt of small kingdoms and fiefdoms. Trade routes shifted, and barter made a comeback. The Mediterranean economy, once dominated by Rome, now saw the rise of the Byzantine Empire and Islamic caliphates, which became hubs of trade and culture. This period also laid down the roots for the rise of the feudal system, where land became the currency of power. Lords and vassals, castles and serfs. The Middle Ages were born from this mix of old and new. And culturally, the so-called Dark Ages were a time of transformation. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving classical knowledge, and even producing new works of literature and philosophy. While Rome's fall did lead to a decline in urban life, it also sparked a migration to rural areas, where new communities formed and old traditions mixed with new ones. The Middle Ages were a crucible of innovation, where the seeds of the Renaissance were planted. So what have we learned from Rome's rise and fall? History has a way of repeating itself, not because we're doomed to relive it, but because we often fail to learn from it. Power, unchecked, can lead to complacency. Economies built on shaky foundations will crumble, and empires that forget to adapt will find themselves relics of the past. The Roman story is a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations are vulnerable to internal strife and external pressures. But let's not end on a gloomy note. The legacy of Rome lives on in our laws, languages, and architecture. It's a testament to the resilience of human culture that we continue to draw inspiration from the past, even as we forge our future. So, as you drift off to sleep, ponder this. Are we repeating history, or are we simply using it as a guide? Maybe it's less about the repetition and more about the remix, taking the best of what was and making it new again. After all, if the Romans taught us anything, it's that history is a tapestry of innovation, ambition, and the relentless march of time. Sweet dreams of marble columns and ancient roads, dear listener. Until next time. In the beginning there was dirt, and not just any dirt, but the kind that would change the world forever, fertile soil, ripe for agricultural innovation. Around 10,000 BCE, while humans were still perfecting the art of not getting eaten by wild animals, someone in the region we now call the Fertile Crescent decided that gathering berries wasn't quite cutting it. They took a leap of faith, planted some seeds, and set humanity on a path that's brought us to Wi-Fi and avocado toast. The Fertile Crescent, stretching like a lazy crescent moon from the Persian Gulf through modern-day Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, was less about crescent-shaped pastries and more about the perfect conditions for agriculture. With rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates doing their best impression of a natural irrigation system, this place was a farmer's dream. If farmers had dreams back then, which they probably did, mostly about not starving, agriculture was the game changer. No longer needing to chase dinner across the savannah, people started putting down roots, both metaphorically and literally. Suddenly, staying in one place didn't just mean you were lazy, it meant you were smart. With food sources finally stable, populations grew, and small settlements began to swell into bustling hubs of activity. Picture early cities like Jericho and Uruk, popping up faster than artisanal coffee shops in a gentrifying neighborhood, each one claiming to be the original. Jericho, often touted as the world's oldest city, dates back to around 9000 BCE. It wasn't exactly the Vegas of its day, but it was a start. With a population that could have been around 2,000 people by 8,000 BCE, Jericho was a bustling metropolis compared to the nomadic camps that had come before. They even had a wall. No, not for keeping out the neighbors, but possibly to manage floodwaters and keep their fields from washing away. Practical, if not quite as exciting as the stories we like to tell ourselves about city defenses. Then there's Uruk, a city that appeared around 4,000 BCE and eventually grew to an estimated population of 50,000 by 3,000 BCE. That's about as many people as you'd find in a small modern town, all squeezed into a few square miles of mud brick buildings and narrow streets. Uruk was the birthplace of riding and beer, among other things. Yes, beer. It turns out our ancestors were as keen on a good brew as we are. They even paid workers in beer, an ancient precursor to the modern paycheck, with the added benefit of a buzz. Now, let's talk about the myth of the peaceful farmer. A lovely image, isn't it? Rosy-cheeked peasants tilling the land, living in harmony with nature and each other. The reality was more Game of Thrones than Little House on the Prairie. Early cities dealt with everything from petty theft to full-blown invasions. And then there were the other nuisances: disease, famine, and of course, the occasional flood. Water management was a constant headache, and when your primary source of water comes with a side of crocodiles, that's a whole other level of stress. Speaking of stress, let's not forget about the bureaucrats. Where there are people, there's paperwork, and ancient cities were no exception. As settlements grew, so did the complexity of managing resources, leading to the birth of bureaucracy. Imagine the joy of being the guy chiseling out tax records on a clay tablet. Fun fact, one of the earliest known written documents is actually a tax receipt. We can't escape taxes, it seems, even with 5,000 years of progress. Sanitation was another adventure. Early urbanites didn't have the luxury of modern plumbing, and waste management was rudimentary at best. It was a dirty job, literally, but someone's gotta do it. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of early drainage systems in places like the Indus Valley, but in the Fertile Crescent, let's just say standards were still evolving. The shift to urban life was monumental. It laid the foundations for the complex societies that followed, complete with social hierarchies, specialized jobs, and the beginnings of what we now call civilization. But it wasn't all smooth sailing or noble pursuits. There was greed, power struggles, and the constant challenge of keeping everyone fed and relatively happy. In other words, ancient urban life was a lot like ours, minus the smartphones, and with a bit more mud. So, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for those early urban pioneers. They traded the uncertainty of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle for the equally daunting challenges of city living, paving the way for everything from Netflix to skyscrapers. And remember, next time you're waiting in line at your favorite coffee shop, that queue is nothing compared to waiting for the annual Nile flood to subside. Progress, right. And speaking of progress, let's stroll over to ancient Egypt, the land of pyramids, pharaohs, and 1,000 myths more elaborate than your great-aunt's conspiracy theories. With its roots firmly planted in the Old Kingdom, around 2686 BCE, this was a civilization that knew how to leave a lasting impression, literally, in stone. The Old Kingdom was the golden age of pyramid building, a time when the Egyptian rulers decided that the best way to ensure their names echoed through eternity was to build colossal tombs that screamed, "I was here." Now, let's tackle the elephant in the room, or rather, the alien spacecraft. Some folks love the idea that extraterrestrials, perhaps on a cosmic gap year, stopped by to help construct these architectural wonders. Not to burst any intergalactic bubbles, but the truth is a bit more down to earth. The pyramids were the product of human ingenuity, sweat, and a workforce that was as organized as your grandma's Tupperware collection. Forget enslaved Israelites or E.T. The builders were skilled laborers who lived in nearby temporary cities, paid in standard Egyptian currency, bread and beer. These workers were no mere slaves. They were respected craftsmen, given sustenance and shelter for their efforts. It's like being on a company retreat, minus the PowerPoint presentations, but with a lot more heavy lifting. The Great Pyramid of Giza, completed around 2560 BCE, used about 3 million blocks, each weighing around 5 tons. Talk about a weighty project. despite the grueling labor. Evidence suggests these workers were well fed and treated with a level of dignity that contradicts the old whip-cracking overseer trope. Enter the pharaohs, masters of ancient PR spin long before press secretaries became a thing. Take Pharaoh Khufu, for example, the man behind the Great Pyramid. His reign was less about ruling with an iron fist and more about crafting an image that would outlast the sands of time. These rulers were the original influencers, commissioning grandiose monuments to cement their divine status and ensure the common folk knew who to thank, an eternal like button etched in stone. Their pyramids were the ultimate status symbols, a way to flex their divine muscles and remind everyone of their god-like prowess. But let's not forget the economic side of this pyramid scheme. Constructing these gargantuan structures wasn't just about leaving a legacy. It was a massive investment in the economy. Think of it as a nationwide job creation program, providing work for thousands, from quarrymen to cooks. The resources poured into pyramid building were immense, requiring a level of organization that rivals any modern infrastructure project. The state provided food and housing, ensuring the workers were healthy and productive. This wasn't just a vanity project. It was a way to stimulate the economy, boost morale, and keep the wheels of society turning. However, the Old Kingdom wasn't all sunshine and sandcastles. The Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, could be a fickle friend. When the annual inundation was just right, it brought fertile silt to the fields, ensuring bountiful harvests and happy pharaohs. But when the river decided to take a year off, or worse, overdo it, famine and chaos weren't far behind. Imagine a civilization so reliant on a single natural event. Without the flood, the fields turned into dust bowls, and the economy took a nosedive faster than you can say crop failure. The very river that could make a kingdom could just as easily break it. Environmental factors weren't just minor inconveniences. They were the difference between prosperity and ruin. As the Old Kingdom drew to a close around 2181 BCE, a series of low Nile floods contributed to the collapse. The centralized government faltered, local rulers, narmarchs, grabbed power, and the once unified empire splintered into a patchwork of competing regions. It was a classic case of too many cooks spoiling the broth, or in this case, too many rulers spoiling the kingdom. So, the next time you hear someone credit aliens or biblical figures with the construction of the pyramids, remember that the reality was both more mundane and more impressive. Human hands, driven by a mix of religious fervor, economic necessity, and a good bit of bread and beer, built these monuments. The pharaohs, ever the savvy marketers, spun tales of divinity and power, while the Nile's unpredictable nature reminded everyone that even the greatest of civilizations could be brought low by the whims of nature. And with that, we've only scratched the surface of Egypt's ancient allure. There's more to uncover, more myths to debunk, and more truths to reveal as we continue our journey through the sands of time. So, stay tuned, because this story is just getting started. As we leave the monumental sands of Egypt behind, let's fast forward to a place where democracy and drama were the daily specials. Athens, the shining star of the Athenian Golden Age. Now, if you think of Athens as a city of philosophers lounging about in togas, discussing the meaning of life under olive trees, you're not entirely wrong. But there's more to the story than just Socratic seminars and amphitheater applause. Picture Athens around the 5th century BCE, bustling with energy and ambition. The population was pushing around 300,000, and it wasn't just philosophers filling the agora's air with hot debates. Merchants, craftsmen, and yes, slaves were the gears turning the Athenian machine. Democracy was the talk of the town, with citizens, well, the male ones, voting on everything from war strategies to festival themes. But before you start romanticizing this as the original utopian society, let's peel back some layers. First up, let's talk about democracy, Athenian style. It was a groundbreaking concept, sure, but one with some serious asterisks. Only about 30,000 of the entire population were full citizens with voting rights, basically free adult males. Women, slaves, and foreign residents, not invited to the party. So, while Athens liked to brag about its democratic system, it was more like a very exclusive club where membership was reserved for a select few. It's like a college frat, without the beer pong, but with a lot more political maneuvering. Speaking of the social scene, let's not overlook Athens' less than glamorous underbelly. Slavery was the backbone of Athenian society, providing the labor force that allowed citizens the leisure to ponder life's big questions. We're talking about 100,000 slaves, give or take, performing everything from household chores to backbreaking labor in the silver mines of Laurium. These mines, by the way, were a major economic engine, with the shiny stuff funding everything from the fleet to those iconic marble temples. So, when you admire the Parthenon, remember it was partly built on the backs of the enslaved. Meanwhile, misogyny was practically a civic duty. Athenian women were relegated to domestic duties, their roles confined to the home much like an ancient footnote. They couldn't own property, vote, or even choose their own spouses. Marriage was more a business arrangement than a love story, and women's education was limited, because who needs philosophy when you've got weaving to do, right? The legendary tales of Athenian freedom conveniently gloss over half the population. Now, let's venture into the world of Athenian politics, a landscape that would make today's political squabbles look like a friendly game of chess. The assembly, or ecclesia, was the stage for heated debates, where any eligible citizen could step up and speak their mind. But it wasn't all high-minded discourse. Political manipulation, bribery, and ostracism were common tactics. Ostracism, for those unfamiliar, was the delightful practice of exiling someone for 10 years if they got too powerful or just plain annoying. Think of it as getting voted off the island. Only the island was your entire city-state. Economic prosperity was another driving force behind Athens' golden glow. The city thrived on trade, with its strategic position near the sea acting as a magnet for goods from across the known world. But this economic boom wasn't just a happy accident. The Athenians, under the astute leadership of Pericles, made sure to reinvest in their city, creating jobs and fostering an environment where arts and culture could flourish. The Acropolis wasn't just a vanity project. It was a statement of Athenian might and sophistication. And then there's philosophy, which deserves its own spotlight. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle weren't just names on a syllabus. They were shaping Western thought in real time. But let's not kid ourselves. The agora wasn't filled with intellectuals nodding sagely at every word. Socrates himself was seen as a bit of a gadfly, challenging the status quo and earning more than a few enemies. His ultimate execution in 399 BCE speaks volumes about the limits of free speech, even in the birthplace of democracy. As Athens basked in its own glow, cracks began to appear. The economic engine that powered the city relied heavily on its empire, network of subject states held together through the Delian League. This wasn't just a friendly alliance. It was more like an ancient protection racket. Pay up, or face the Athenian navy. But when the Peloponnesian War broke out with Sparta, Athens found itself stretched too thin. The war, which lasted from 431 BCE to 404 BCE, drained resources and morale. It's like they were trying to run a marathon with one shoelace untied. The end of the war left Athens battered and humbled, its empire in tatters. The once mighty city now had to grapple with the realities of defeat and occupation. Spartans didn't just win the war, they imposed an oligarchy, the infamous 30 tyrants, who ruled with an iron fist and none of the democratic niceties. It was a stark reminder that even the brightest flames can be snuffed out. So, as we delve into the Athenian Golden Age, it's clear that this was a period of contrasts. While Athens gave the world democracy and philosophy, it also showcased the complexities and contradictions of human nature. The city was a beacon of progress, yet mired in practices that would make us cringe today. The glory of Athens wasn't just in its achievements, but in the messy, complicated reality of its existence. And with that, we've painted a picture of Athens that's a bit more nuanced than the postcard version. But don't worry, we're just getting started. There's plenty more to explore, from the fall of Athens to the rise of new powers. So, keep your sandals on, because this historical journey has plenty of twists and turns ahead. Just as Athens' once dazzling democracy dimmed, let's shift our gaze to Rome, a city where power was as intoxicating as a fine Falonian wine, and just as likely to leave you with a headache. Forget the toga-wearing, laurel-wreathed heroes of Hollywood fame for a moment. The Roman Republic was a hotbed of economic inequality and political chicanery that would make any modern scandal look like a child's playdate gone slightly awry. First, Let's take a gander at the economic disparities that gnawed at the heart of Rome like a hungry wolf at a carcass. By the late Republic, around 100 BCE, Rome was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, you had the patricians, wealthy aristocrats lounging in their lavish villas, where the only thing they had to worry about was whether their new mosaic floor clashed with the frescoes. On the other hand, the plebeians, commoners packed into cramped insulae or apartment blocks that could give tenement housing a run for its money. Think of it as the ancient version of a 99% VS, 1% scenario, but with more sandals and fewer hashtags. Now, how did things get so lopsided? One word: conquest. As Rome gobbled up territories faster than a binge-watching session of your favorite series, its economy swelled with the spoils of war. Land, slaves, and wealth poured in, but wealth distribution was about as fair as a rigged dice game in a smoky tavern. The rich got richer, buying up vast tracts of land worked by slaves imported from the latest battlefield. Meanwhile, the small-time Roman farmer found himself edged out, his farms swallowed by the sprawling estates of the elite. The result, a migration of displaced farmers into the city, swelling the ranks of the urban poor and setting the stage for social unrest. Speaking of unrest, let's not forget the Senate, a political body that could rival any soap opera in terms of drama and intrigue. These toga-clad senators weren't just debating philosophy or gladiator match schedules. They were masters of corruption, operating in a system where bribery was as common as a Roman bathhouse. The Roman political scene was a veritable circus of backstabbing, vote-buying, and alliances shakier than a Jenga tower in an earthquake. In fact, one of the Republic's favorite pastimes seemed to be political scandal. Lucius Sergius Catilina's conspiracy to overthrow the government in 63 BCE is just one juicy example. It was a time when crossing the aisle might mean literally drawing a dagger. As for the transition from Republic to Empire, let's talk about Julius Caesar, Rome's celebrity general who had a penchant for dramatic gestures. His infamous crossing of the Rubicon River in 49 BCE wasn't so much a heroic act as a midlife crisis with geopolitical consequences. By leading his army into Italy, Caesar wasn't just defying the Senate. He was essentially tossing the Roman equivalent of a Molotov cocktail into a political powder keg. It was a gamble that paid off for him, at least, leading to his dictatorship and the eventual demise of the Republic. His bold move might have been the ancient equivalent of buying a sports car, but it shifted the course of Roman history forever. Now, let's not overlook the secret ingredient that kept the Roman populace from rioting in the streets: bread and circuses. This wasn't just a catchy phrase. It was a deliberate policy of providing free grain and spectacular entertainment to keep the masses content and conveniently distracted. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, and public executions were the ancient version of Netflix and chill, but with a lot more blood and sand. By 140 BCE, Rome was importing about 3 million bushels of grain annually just to keep its citizens fed and complacent. It was a strategy as cunning as it was effective, ensuring that the common folk were too busy cheering in the Colosseum to notice the political machinations happening behind the scenes. But while the games provided a temporary balm, the underlying issues festered. The Republic was a house of cards, teetering on a foundation of inequality, corruption, and political strife. These weren't just footnotes in Rome's history. They were the writing on the wall, foretelling the Republic's eventual collapse and the rise of imperial rule under Augustus. So, as we ponder the Roman Republic, let's remember that beneath the marble facade and the rhetoric of the Senate lay a society grappling with the same flaws and ambitions that continue to shape our world today. As we leave the chaos of the Roman Republic behind, there's much more to unravel in the story of Rome's transition to empire. The path from Caesar to Augustus is paved with ambition, betrayal, and enough intrigue to keep even the most jaded historian on the edge of their seat. So, stay tuned as we delve deeper into the machinations that forged an empire and the legacy it left behind. The tale is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be as riveting as a chariot race in the Circus Maximus. And so, as the curtain falls on the turbulent saga of Rome's transition from Republic to Empire, let's fast forward to the grand finale, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, an event that's often reduced to a simplistic narrative of barbarian invasions. Picture a crumbling empire, not as a fortress besieged by hordes of hairy barbarians, but as a creaky old house plagued by termites, collapsing from within while everyone points fingers at the wind. First, let's address those so-called barbarian invasions. Yes, folks like the Visigoths, Vandals, and Huns did their part in delivering the final blows, but suggesting they alone brought Rome to its knees is like blaming a single raindrop for a flood. The Western Roman Empire was already a house of cards by the time Alaric and his Visigoth buddies sacked Rome in 410 CE. The truth is, the Western Empire was the architect of its own doom, a victim of its own vastness, and an economic model that was about as stable as a Jenga tower in a windstorm. Rome's economy, once a well-oiled machine running on conquest and slave labor, had hit a wall. By the 4th century, the empire was stretched thinner than a Roman senator's patience with a toga malfunction. Maintaining a border that spanned roughly 10,000 miles was no small feat, especially when your treasury was emptier than a gladiatorial arena on a rainy day. Inflation ran rampant, with coins being devalued faster than you could say denarius. The empire's reliance on slave labor didn't help either. As conquest slowed, so did the influx of new slaves, leaving a gaping hole in the labor market that nobody seemed eager to fill. Then there were the political blunders, a greatest hits collection of missteps that would make any modern politician blush. The empire was plagued by a revolving door of emperors, each less competent than the last. In the 50 years leading up to the empire's fall, 26 different emperors wore the crown, and let's just say, the turnover rate was less about career advancements and more about assassinations. The administrative inefficiencies and power struggles left the empire as stable as a three-legged stool. And when Emperor Diocletian decided to split the empire into eastern and western halves in 285 CE, you'd think it was a genius move, like cutting a pie to make it last longer. But instead, it just made it easier to consume. Speaking of consumption, the empire's social fabric was fraying. The military, once the pride of Rome, was now a shadow of its former self, filled with mercenaries of dubious loyalty. Picture an army where half the soldiers couldn't even pronounce Roma Invicta without consulting their phrasebooks. These hired hands were more interested in a paycheck than patriotism, and when the chips were down, their allegiance was as reliable as a sandcastle in a storm. The Western Roman Empire had become a bloated bureaucracy, struggling to manage its sprawling territories while its people grappled with crushing taxation and dwindling public services. So, when the Visigoths showed up at the gates, Rome was already on life support. The sack of Rome was less a hostile takeover and more a demolition of an already condemned building. By the time the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE, the empire had already been reduced to a shell of its former self. It was a fittingly anticlimactic end for a civilization that once ruled the known world. Let's debunk the myth that the fall of Rome was an overnight sensation. It was a slow burn, a gradual decline that took centuries to unfold. The empire had been rotting from the inside, its foundation weakened by economic mismanagement, political infighting, and societal decay. It was a cautionary tale of hubris and overreach, a reminder that even the mightiest of empires can crumble under the weight of their own excesses. And what can we learn from Rome's long, drawn-out demise? It's a bit like that gym membership you signed up for in January. You know the one. You can have all the potential in the world, but if you don't pay attention to the details, you'll be left with nothing but unfulfilled promises and a whole lot of regrets. Rome's fall is a stark reminder that empires, much like personal ambitions, need constant vigilance and adaptation to survive the test of time. As we wrap up this historical roller coaster, let's take a moment to ponder the legacy of Rome. It's easy to romanticize the empire's grandeur, to get lost in the myths of gladiators and Caesars, but the real story is found in the messiness of human nature, the ambition, the greed, the ingenuity, and the inevitable decline. It's a tale as old as time, one that echoes through the ages, reminding us that history's lessons are only as valuable as the attention we choose to give them. So, as you drift off into the realm of dreams, ponder these tales of triumph and tragedy, of lessons learned and forgotten. The story of Rome is not just a chapter in a history book. It's a reflection of the eternal dance between power and purpose, a dance that continues to play out in the world today. May your dreams be filled with the wisdom of the past, and may you wake up ready to face the future with a fresh perspective and an appreciation for the complexity of history's tapestry. In the grand theater of history, the Sumerians are like that unexpected indie band that suddenly drops a chart-topping album. They didn't just play the ancient world, they invented the instruments. We're talking about the scribes of Sumer, the rock stars of reeds and clay tablets, who gave humanity its first taste of writing. And boy, did they have a lot to say, or at least a lot to count. Around 3500 BCE, these folks in southern Mesopotamia decided they were tired of keeping everything in their heads and started scribbling down the first cuneiform scripts. This wasn't your average diary entry or epic poem, though. Nope, this was the primal scream of bureaucracy unleashed onto the world. Now, you might be thinking, writing, how romantic, like some ancient Jane Austen novel. Hold that thought. The first thing they wrote about wasn't love stories or tales of heroism. It was grain, lots and lots of grain. The Sumerians had perfected the art of counting barley, sheep, and goats like an accountant with a newfound love for Excel. Why? Because when you've got burgeoning city-states like Uruk and Ur, each bustling with thousands of people, someone has to keep track of who owes what. And thus, writing became the Sumerian way of saying, hey, we need to talk about your outstanding balance. Economically, this innovation was like discovering the cheat codes for civilization building. Writing turned trade into a complex dance of IOUs and receipts. Sumerians could now manage their irrigation systems and organize labor for their ziggurats with the precision of a Swiss watch. But the real kicker, taxes. That's right, folks. Once they started writing, they stumbled onto the concept of taxation faster than you can spell. Bureaucratic nightmare. The first known tax complaints didn't come from disgruntled peasants, but from the scribes themselves, who had to tally up all those numbers. Imagine the eye rolls when the temple priests sauntered over with another cartload of sheep, demanding their share. Speaking of priests, let's not forget their role as the world's inaugural tax collectors. Picture them, decked out in their finest robes, wielding styluses with the authority of a modern IRS agent. They'd ensure the guards got their cut, usually about 10% of the harvest. And if you thought audits were stressful now, try explaining to a priest why your crop yield was mysteriously low this year. Divine intervention, or just a bad season, you decide. And while the Sumerians might have been the first to complain about taxes, they also pioneered the idea of economic records, a practice that has haunted humans ever since. Cuneiform tablets detailing transactions, taxes, and trade agreements are the ancient equivalent of that shoebox full of receipts you swear you'll organize one day. These tablets were the original spreadsheets, allowing Sumerian society to function with an efficiency that would make any modern accountant tip their hat. But let's not romanticize these early bureaucrats too much. Sure, they laid the groundwork for civilization, but they also opened Pandora's box of red tape. As city-states grew more complex, so did the records. Soon, you'd need a PhD in cuneiform just to understand the tax code. And the scribes, they were the overworked, underpaid heroes behind it all, with ink-stained fingers and a penchant for grumbling about the latest temple edict. So, the next time you find yourself grumbling about taxes or drowning in paperwork, spare a thought for those ancient scribes of Sumer. They gave us the gift of writing, yes, but they also unwittingly invented the first office job. And if that's not a legacy worthy of both admiration and a little chuckle, I don't know what is. And if that's not a legacy worthy of both admiration and a little chuckle, I don't know what is. But let's shift our gaze from the dusty tablets of Mesopotamia to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, where the pyramids rise like ancient skyscrapers, only without the handy elevator music. You see, the pyramids weren't just the ultimate flex of architectural prowess. They were also masterclasses in economic overkill and labor logistics that would give any modern project manager a migraine. First, let's shadow one of the most persistent myths with the force of 1,000 falling limestone blocks. Aliens did not help build the pyramids. Sorry, UFO enthusiasts, the only little green men involved, were probably the hapless workers feeling a bit queasy from the sun. The real architects behind these colossal tombs were human, and they were driven by a combination of religious fervor and the kind of ambition that makes climbing Everest look like a casual weekend hike. The construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza, for instance, wasn't just a few pharaohs waving their hands and magically summoning a workforce. We're talking about a 20-year endeavor involving around 3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 5 to 15 tons. And no, they didn't have access to the kind of cranes you'd find at a modern construction site. Instead, they relied on the raw power of human and animal labor, plus a few ingenious tricks. So how did they pull off this Herculean task? Enter the Egyptian workforce, not slaves as often misrepresented, but a well-fed, organized crew of seasonal laborers. These folks were likely farmers, taking a break from sowing and reaping to engage in a little pyramid building on the side. And guess what? They were compensated for their efforts, primarily in the form of food, beer, and tax exemptions. Because let's be honest, nothing motivates better than free booze and a tax break. The logistics of moving these gigantic stones were nothing short of a marvel. Imagine dragging a 15-ton block across the desert. Egyptians likely used sledges and water to lubricate the sand, reducing friction. This clever bit of engineering was essentially an ancient version of WD-40. Recent experiments suggest that by wetting the sand in front of a sledge, the friction was cut in half, making it feasible for a team of workers to haul these behemoths across the land. And speaking of logistics, let's not overlook the precision involved in the pyramid's construction. The Great Pyramid was aligned with true north within a fraction of a degree, a feat that would impress any modern-day surveyor. This wasn't just a happy accident. It was the result of meticulous planning and a deep understanding of astronomy. The Egyptians might not have had computers, but they certainly had a good grasp of the night sky. Now, why go through all this trouble for a glorified tomb? Welcome to the world of Egyptian afterlife beliefs, where the pharaohs planned for their next life with the same fervor as someone prepping for a particularly extravagant retirement. The pyramids weren't just stone monuments. They were spiritual launch pads designed to catapult the pharaohs into the afterlife, armed with all the comforts they could imagine. Think of them as the ultimate go big or go home statements. The economic context here is fascinating. The resources poured into pyramid construction were immense, yet they also served as a way to redistribute wealth and stabilize society. By employing thousands of workers, the state provided food and security, while the monumental nature of the pyramids reinforced the divine status of the pharaohs. It was a win-win, provided you weren't the one lugging stones under the unforgiving sun. Of course, the grandeur of these projects can't mask the underlying social dynamics. The pyramids were as much about displaying power as they were about religious devotion. They were the ancient equivalent of a billionaire's yacht, a testament to the pharaoh's wealth and influence. But while the pyramids have stood the test of time, the pharaoh's plans for a comfortable afterlife were often thwarted by grave robbers with a keen eye for treasure. Turns out, not even the mightiest rulers were safe from a good old-fashioned burglary. And so, as we marvel at these ancient wonders, let's remember the thousands who toiled to make them a reality. They remind us that behind every grandiose vision lies a workforce that turned the impossible into stone-clad reality. Though ancient Egypt might have been a land of gods and pharaohs, it was also a society of ordinary people who contributed to extraordinary feats. As we reflect on these towering legacies, it's clear that the story of the pyramids is as much about human ingenuity and ambition as it is about the relentless pursuit of eternity. With the shadows of the pyramids receding in our historical rearview mirror, we now set sail across the choppy seas of the Mediterranean to the bustling city-state of Athens. Ah, Athens, the legendary cradle of democracy. Or was it? Spoiler alert. The version of democracy you've heard about might be a little like the Instagram filter of history. Great for the highlights, but it glosses over a few messy details. Let's start by setting the scene in 5th century BCE Athens during what historians like to call the Golden Age. Imagine a city pulsing with intellectual energy, where philosophers held court in public squares, and citizens gathered to discuss the big questions of life, the universe, and everything, except not everyone was invited to the party. Athens was home to around 250,000 people, but the vaunted democratic system only included about 30,000 male citizens. That's right, folks, women, slaves, and foreigners were as welcome in Athenian politics as a toga at a black tie gala. Now, let's get to the heart of the Athenian political system. At its core was the assembly, or ecclesia, where decisions about war, peace, and the price of olives were hashed out. Picture it as a lively town hall meeting, only instead of people raising their hands, they shouted their opinions loud enough to make a Spartan blush. But here's the kicker. Participation was technically open to all male citizens, but in practice, it was a bit like offering free skydiving lessons. Great if you had the time and money, but not realistic for your average Joe plowman tied to his olive groves. The truth is, Athens' democracy was exclusive, operating like an elite club where the entry requirements were more about birthright than merit. The political elite, wealthy aristocrats with time to spare and plenty of drachmas, dominated the scene. And while the idea of every citizen having a say sounds lovely, in reality, it was often the loudest, most persuasive voices that carried the day. Think of it as the ancient version of talk radio, where the Socratic method met the market square. Speaking of Socrates, let's talk about the philosophers. Athens is often hailed as the birthplace of Western philosophy, but it wasn't exactly the Enlightenment playground we fondly imagine. Socrates, that pesky gadfly of Athens, spent his days questioning the status quo and poking holes in the arguments of the city's brightest minds. His method was simple. Ask enough questions until everyone realized they knew nothing. It was the original mic drop, and it didn't always endear him to Athenian society. But here's the twist in our philosophical tale. Socrates' dedication to truth and wisdom landed him in a heap of trouble. In 399 BCE, he was put on trial and sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and impiety, essentially for being a buzzkill at philosophical parties. His execution, by a hemlock cocktail, serves as a stark reminder that Athens wasn't all sunshine and symposiums. The city valued free thought, sure, but only up to the point where it threatened the social order. Now, let's layer in the economic context. Athens' golden age was fueled by a robust economy built on trade, silver mining, and yes, the labor of slaves. The Athenian silver mines at Laurium were a jackpot that funded their naval prowess and architectural wonders like the Parthenon. This influx of wealth allowed Athens to project power throughout the Aegean, but it also highlights the uncomfortable truth that much of their prosperity rested on the backs of those who didn't share in the spoils of democracy. The Delian League, an Athenian-led alliance, was ostensibly a coalition of equals, but in reality, it functioned more like a protection racket. Member states contributed ships or money, but defying Athens' leadership was about as wise as challenging Zeus to a lightning duel. The tribute from these states filled Athenian coffers and allowed them to maintain their impressive fleet, but it also sowed the seeds of resentment that would eventually lead to the Peloponnesian War. And speaking of war, let's not ignore the military might that underpinned Athenian democracy. The hoplite soldiers and the formidable trireme fleet were the backbone of Athens' power, ensuring that their political experiments were conducted under the protective umbrella of military strength. Yet, the constant need for expansion and defense meant that even in a democracy, war was never far from the agenda. So, while Athens certainly gave the world a political system that inspired generations, it wasn't quite the egalitarian utopia we might imagine. It was a society of stark contrasts. Intellectual brilliance, economic prowess, and democratic ideals, juxtaposed against social exclusion and imperial ambition. The allure of Athenian democracy lies not only in its pioneering spirit, but also in its very human contradictions. As we leave Athens, poised to explore the next chapter of our historical journey, we're reminded that history is never as black and white as the marble statues might suggest. The myths we cherish often cast long shadows, but behind them lies a more nuanced tale of ambition, power, and human nature. And that, dear listeners, is where the real story begins. And so, as we wave goodbye to the philosophical highs and democratic lows of Athens, we harp on our historical time machine and head west to the land of togas, triumphs, and let's face it, a whole lot of marble. Rome. Ah, Rome, where engineering feats reached dizzying heights, and the city's PR machine spun tales so grand you'd think they'd hired the ancient world's finest storytellers. But let's peel back that glossy veneer and see what really made the Roman Empire tick. First stop, those iconic Roman roads. If you've ever heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome, you'll know we're diving into one of the empire's most enduring legacies. But were these highways of history as revolutionary as they seem? Let's break it down. The Roman road network spanned over 400,000 kilometers, with about 80,000 kilometers paved. That's like paving a path all the way to the moon and then some. But before you start imagining smooth rides on ancient chariots, remember that these roads weren't exactly Autobahn quality. Sure, they were straight, durable, and ingeniously engineered, but they were also bone-rattlingly bumpy. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of driving a sports car on a gravel track. These roads were the arteries of the empire, facilitating trade, troop movements, and perhaps most importantly, tax collection. And while they were a marvel of engineering, they also came with a hefty price tag. Constructing these roads was an expensive endeavor, costing the Roman state millions of denarii. The question is, who footed the bill? Surprise, surprise. It was the provinces, taxed to the hilt to fund their own subjugation. Talk about a raw deal. But for Rome, it was a strategic investment, ensuring that the empire could project power and maintain control across vast distances. In short, those roads were less about getting from A to B and more about showing everyone who was really in charge. Next up, let's quench our thirst with Rome's famed aqueducts. The average Roman citizen had access to about 1,000 liters of water a day, a figure that would make even the most modern city dwellers green with envy. But before we get too misty-eyed over these waterworks, let's consider the logistics. Building an aqueduct wasn't just a matter of digging a trench and calling it a day. These structures stretched for miles, with some like the Aqua Marcia reaching over 91 kilometers. And while they carried water from distant springs into the heart of Rome, the costs were staggering. The Aqua Claudia, for instance, took 14 years to build and cost a fortune in both cash and human labor. And let's not forget the human cost. The laborers who toiled under the sun, carving out these monumental structures, weren't exactly doing it for the love of Roman engineering. Many were slaves or conscripted laborers, their contributions largely unacknowledged, as the glory went to the emperors who commissioned these projects. But the aqueducts weren't just about providing water. They were about showcasing Roman superiority. They stood as testaments to the empire's ability to bend nature to its will, a watery flex that told the world Rome was a force to be reckoned with. Now, if you're picturing Roman citizens lounging in opulent public baths, you're not entirely wrong. The baths of Caracalla, for example, were the ancient world's version of a luxury spa day, complete with hot and cold rooms, exercise areas, and even libraries. But these civic palaces served more than just the purpose of hygiene and relaxation. They were political tools, designed to pacify the masses and keep them entertained. After all, a populace soaking in warm waters is less likely to revolt. Yet these baths also required constant maintenance and a steady supply of water, demanding even more from those aqueducts. And what would Rome be without its gladiatorial games? Cue the roar of the crowd, the clash of swords, and the smell of, well, let's just say the Colosseum wasn't exactly fragrant. These games were the ultimate form of Roman entertainment, a spectacle of blood and bravado that captivated the populace. But behind the pageantry lay a brutal reality. Gladiators were often slaves, prisoners, or volunteers seeking fame and fortune, and the games were as much about politics as they were about entertainment. They served as a distraction from the empire's problems, a way for emperors to curry favor with the public and display their generosity. Economically, the games were a colossal investment. Maintaining a stable of gladiators wasn't cheap, and neither was the construction of the Colosseum itself. The Flavian Amphitheater, as it was known, could seat up to 50,000 spectators, and was financed by the spoils of the Jewish war, a not-so-subtle reminder of Rome's military might. Yet, for all their glory, the games also highlighted the empire's darker side, where human lives were expendable in the pursuit of spectacle. And speaking of spectacle, let's not overlook the role of Roman propaganda. The emperors were masters of spin, using architecture, entertainment, and public works to project an image of unassailable power. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was less a period of tranquility and more a carefully cultivated illusion. The empire was a patchwork of conquered territories held together by force, diplomacy, and a fair bit of fear. But to the average Roman citizen, it was a golden age, a time when the empire seemed invincible. So, as we stroll through Rome's storied streets, let's remember that the empire's grandeur was built on a foundation of economic pragmatism and human toil. The roads and aqueducts, the baths and games, all served a dual purpose: to elevate Rome's status and keep its citizens content. Yet, beneath the marble facade lay a world of complexity, where ambition and pragmatism walked hand in hand. As we ponder these ancient wonders, we see a society that, for all its advancements, was still grappling with the same issues that challenge us today: power, politics, and the cost of progress. Rome may have been a city of dreams, but it was also a city of stark realities, a reminder that history's most enduring legacies are often built on the backs of those who came before. So, as we leave the eternal city behind, let's carry forward the lessons of its rise and fall, ready to explore the next chapter in our historical journey. As we leave the eternal city behind, let's take a collective breath and glance back at the sprawling tapestry of ancient history we've unraveled. It's a bit like stepping away from an epic Netflix series, where each episode left us with more questions than answers, and the plot twists were as unpredictable as the weather during British summer. First, let's talk about technological advancements because, let's face it, humans have always been suckers for shiny new gadgets. From the Sumerians' cuneiform, which was less about epic love stories and more about the ancient equivalent of a debt ledger, to the Romans' aqueducts, which were essentially high-pressure hoses of imperial power, ancient innovations were all about practicality. These weren't just intellectual exercises, they were survival tactics. The Sumerians didn't write to become the next Shakespeare. They wrote to avoid angry mobs demanding their barley back. The Egyptians didn't construct pyramids just to defy gravity. They wanted to ensure their pharaohs had a cushy afterlife, no Wi-Fi needed. And those Roman roads, they were less about scenic road trips and more about making sure legions could stomp across Europe without detours. Now, you might think these feats were grand gestures of progress, but here's the kicker. They were largely driven by a simple motivation: control. Control the grain, control the guards, control the people. Whether it was the Sumerians accounting tablets or Rome's sprawling road network, these advancements weren't just about making life easier. They were about keeping society in check. The real power wasn't in the stones or the scripts, but in the systems they upheld. So next time you grumble about your smartphone's battery life, remember that ancient innovations were the original apps, designed to keep the chaos at bay. And while we're on the topic of control, let's not forget societal hierarchies. Every civilization we've encountered had its own version of the upstairs-downstairs dynamic. The Sumerians had their scribes and priests, Egypt its pharaohs and laborers, Athens its citizens and slaves, and Rome its senators and plebeians. The idea of a classless society was as foreign to them as a vegan burger at a Roman banquet. These structures weren't just social quirks. They were the backbone of ancient economies. They dictated who built, who ruled, and who got to enjoy the fruits of others' labor. But here's where it gets messy. The notion of the noble savage, that idyllic idea of ancient people living in harmonious balance with nature, is as mythical as a unicorn on roller skates. Romantic as it sounds, the truth is ancient life was a brutal, chaotic scramble for resources. Sure, there were moments of peace and prosperity, but these were often punctuated by war, famine, and the occasional plague. The ancients weren't living in a perpetual state of cumbaya. They were just trying to make it to the next harvest without getting skewered by a neighboring tribe. So, what can this cavalcade of ancient chaos teach us about today's world? For starters, it reminds us that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Our societies are still grappling with the same issues of power, inequality, and technological upheaval. The tools may have evolved from reeds and clay to silicon chips, but the underlying human dynamics are eerily familiar. The past echoes in our algorithms, our politics, and even our boardrooms. History isn't just a dusty relic. It's a mirror reflecting our ongoing struggle to balance ambition with humility. Let's wrap this up with a sharp historical observation. The ancients were masters of adaptation. They didn't just survive. They thrived by bending the world to their will, often with a dash of ingenuity and a dollop of audacity. So, as we ponder their legacies, these towering pyramids, enduring roads, and inscrutable scripts, let's remember they were built by people who dared to dream big even when the odds were stacked against them. Their stories remind us that progress is messy, often brutal, and rarely linear. But it's also what makes us human. In the end, the real legacy of ancient history isn't just in the monuments they left behind, but in the lessons we can glean from their triumphs and failures. So, as you drift off to sleep, let your dreams be filled with the echoes of those who came before, the whispers of a time when humanity was just beginning to write its story in stone and clay. And remember, dear listeners, that history isn't just a record of the past. It's a guidepost for the future, nudging us ever onward, one ancient step at a time.